Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is the Vasto of White in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 71. Spiritual wind blew from around Eisen in whitish blue wisps surrounding him in a funnel-like shape amidst the eyes of all. This was it. It was done. After all these years, he'd reached this point. Opening and closing his left hand, space distorted around his fingers as a blackish hue tinged the spiritual wind around him, giving it a sense of desolation. However, within that desolation and contrasted by the soft glow, was the power of the king. A power of renewal to make the world anew. A low chuckle escaped Eisen's lips, the man dropping his arms to his side and merely basking in the glow of his achievement. In contrast, everyone else's features were dark. None more so than the Zero Squad, Quincy, and Shinigami. Kisuke, who had appeared with his fellow captains supported by the domain of his Bankai, arrived to see this moment before their eyes. It was less than pleasant, the Vizard, captains, and all those directly affected by Eisen's machinations glowering in futility. This was just how it is. In the grand scheme of battle, the victors often aren't those who contribute the most or earn the most honors, but instead, it's those who can profit amidst the chaos of rival factions. In this instance, Eisen was the chief profiteer, having bided his time away from the senses of everyone else until an opportunity presented itself before him. The aura surrounding Eisen was practically no different from the natural pressure Wywak exuded, but then again, they were drawing their power from the same source. A single pool had now given rise to two outlets, granted one had had more time to draw in more resources. Eisen hadn't been able to obtain all the power, but it was substantial enough to elevate him to the required threshold. Haribel and the rest held an air of apprehensions in regards to Eisen, but it was only natural as they weren't as trusting as Shiro was, or as confident in suppressing Eisen as him. Be that as it may, Shiro treated the man as an ally, so they extended the same courtesy and tacitly moved to surround Eisen against the Zero Squad, Quincy, and Kisuke. Eisen paid no mind to outside external factors any longer. Standing within the space of his own domain meted out through suppression of a higher being, he was beyond the reach of those who'd yet to reach this level. Needless to say, when Spiritual Arrow took the opportunity to pass through the blockade made up of Haribel and the others and struck Eisen on the head, he merely frowned. The arrow spilt into crackling arcs of lightning that sought to fry and sear his flesh, but they hardly did anything to his clothes. He didn't so much as flinch before glancing in the direction of the shooter. "But that's impossible," a woman uttered, faltering as she took a staggering step back from the weight of a stair alone. It was a Quincy with light green hair writhing with tendrils of electricity. Eisen tilted his chin up, regarding the Quincy around him with an air of contempt. Personal research in his interrogation of Giselle, a member of the Sternritter, allowed him an idea of the Sternritter's abilities and weaknesses. "How foolish," he said, shaking his head before narrowing his eyes and shooting back the electricity dancing over him towards the shooter. The woman buckled, raising her arms up to form a spiritual shield, but even then, she was blasted with a far greater intensity than her own attack. Tumbling over the ground, the woman barely stopped at the edge of the Soul King's podium. Upon hearing the derision in Eisen's words, many Quincy grimaced, knowing that they weren't directed solely on the attacker, but on the Sternritter as a whole. "Oh, do you not agree?" Eisen's lips curled into a condescending sneer. "The variety of your abilities and strengths may vary, but they all possess an aspect that is above a mere weakness. It is a fatal flaw." "Bullshit." A Quincy with a purple mohawk and arms suffused in flames screamed in anger. "How crass," Eisen smirked. "Though I suppose it's only natural that Drabble gifted with power too weak to pose a limitation would scream the loudest." Hashwalth, the leading figure of the Sternritter, frowned, lips thinning at the words. The fact that he didn't speak up in reply spoke volumes that he'd understood what was being hinted. "You bastard." Eisen shrugged in silence, if only to prove a point before continuing. "You see, you Quincy are interesting in that aspects of your power drawn from your king contradict each other. For instance, a specimen I came upon within Hueco Mundo had an intriguing ability to lock down space and cage enemies within a barrier of spiritual energy. Supposedly, it was to be inescapable, and yet interestingly enough, it broke. Why is this?" Further interrogation of another captive revealed that the jail couldn't affect fellow Quincy. "How intriguing, yes. That means nothing." "No." This word was deafening. Unfortunately, it means everything. Your power stems from Wywak, and Wywaka's power stems from the Soul King, whom I now share a similar source of power with. In the same vein, the energy coursing through me might as well designate me as a Quincy, or Wywak himself. In which case, could the power granted upon you be used against the source? Of course not. This, in essence, is why Quincy aren't permitted to fight amongst themselves. Why else could the jail be rendered ineffective when trying to restrain a Quincy? Why else would none of you ever hope to stand a chance at rebellion? All this to say, Kisuk continued his own explanation on his side in the same vein as Aizen, a sour expression over his face contrasting the steady calm of Aizen's. I am your god / he is their god. Like minds think alike, especially with fellow rivals. Aizen's back straightened, a hand combing back his hair in the face of oppressive silence exacerbated only by the panting breath of Ichibe, who'd abruptly swung his brush over Aizen. Unexpectedly, black ink had failed to splatter out from the hairs of the brush. Instead, the strike was unbearably slow even by Ajicha's standards. Ichibe was pale, his breathing hoarse. There was a kind of unnerved disbelief clouding his features, so black that the jovialness he was known for was entirely absent. What have you done? A smile crept up Aizen's mouth as he replied. I took what's mine. The power you laud as your own was never yours to begin with, smiling monk. No, you too are tied to the Soul King's power of your own volition. You will only die when the Soul King's power perishes, but in the same vein, you're linked. I who has tapped into the power of the king can take away the energy stored within you. Saying this, Aizen raised a palm up, wisps of spiritual energy tied to Ichibe and the others congregating into a sphere. You see, different from the Quincy who were gifted their abilities through Wywak as a medium, the energy of the Royal Guard is a source that I need not wrestle Wywak for control over. Impossible, it makes no sense. Nimea was the first to protest, but he immediately became unsure at the sheer confidence Aizen exuded. Impossible? The power you possess as Royal Guards is but a fraction of the greater whole. Wywak has been in sole possession of the Soul King's power all this while, but why is it that the very power that fuels you wasn't taken away? Amusement perhaps? Some feeble resistance? Or at the bare minimum, disregard? Nimea, Senjumeru, Hikaifuan, Ichibe, and the rest appeared distinctly unsettled, glancing at each other with varying expressions of doubt and disbelief. None of them were fools or slow-witted, they understood what Aizen was hinting, but could say nothing even in protest. No matter, I must take what I can with Wywak hoarding the vast majority. Therefore, Tissen, as promised. Tissen, who'd been loyally by Aizen all this time, shuddered in anticipation, as he suddenly appeared by Aizen's side. Obviously, Aizen had been keeping his presence shrouded in Kyuka Suijutsu's illusions. Understood. To think that this day would finally come. Old friend, I will give you justice. Tissen stepped towards the weakened members of the Zero Squad and unsheathed his sword. At the same time, Aizen used his newfound power to shatter apart the walls of the Soul King's palace, and expose the inner sanctum to the fighting outside. Almost instantly, the aftermath of the clash between Shiro and Wywak became apparent to all. Deep trenches lay scattered upon barren land, fires flickering in the horizon. Black spatial cracks had formed in the air, no different from Gargantes, but volatile and pulsing with chaotic spiritual energy. Most noticeable was the stark change in Shiro's form. He was bladed in all senses of the word. His skin had taken on a metallic sheen, seemingly made out of a mesh-like lattice of miniature sword fragments. Circuit patterns flowed up and down his body like tribal markings, pulsing with a foreign energy no one could have ever imagined was fueled by magecraft. Smirking, Aizen Flash stepped into the heart of the confrontation, putting an end to a long-since propagated deadlock. Aizen. Took you long enough. Shiro's tone was metallic, sounding more like ringing steel than proper human vocals before he shifted his attention back to Wywak. I win, he stated. Naturally, Aizen interjected. Obviously, you've chosen the winning hand from the beginning. Frowning, Wywak turned his sights from Aizen, to the Soul King's palace, then to the Zero Squad. Truly, with his senses he'd been able to perceive the happenings within the palace up until the point Aizen intervened with whatever the Zero Squad had in mind. If Ichibe had succeeded, Wywak had surmised that half the problem would be settled, as the Dem monk wouldn't have hesitated to put down Berrigan and the others after funneling the Soul King's power into himself. However, Aizen's unexpected reversal changed the scenario entirely. Aizen had created an illusion to hide his presence that had even been enough to subtly influence Waiwak. Special war potential indeed, Waiwak murmured to himself inwardly. Outwardly, he stared coldly at his stern ritter. How useless! He mouthed before clasping either hand into fists and funneling spiritual energy into two identical spheres. Upon sighting what Waiwak was doing, many Quincy panicked, taking steps back in trepidation. "My king, no wait. We can still fight," they called out desperately. The protests were to no avail. "Auswallen," Waiwak declared, taking back the power he'd granted to his stern ritter and redistributing it to the worthy. Holy selection was enacted again. With this power, even Quincy who'd been killed could be resurrected using the energy of the other Quincy. Of course, those Quincy whose powers were taken would either die from depletion, or were rendered mere humans. Flickering spiritual energy of the entire stern ritter was channeled into a select few, elevating their strengths beyond that of their individual means. The only ones of the original Star Knights were the Scoot Staffel, Waiwaka's protective echelon, and Hashwalth. The response to Waiwaka's actions were swift. "Espada!" Haribal called out, Berrigan harumphing at being ordered, but appearing by Shiro's side anyway along with his compatriots. Appearing in a row were Coyote, Berrigan, Haribal, Ulquira, Grimjo, Apasai, Mila Rose, Sung Sun, Araniro, and Brands. Excluding Coyote who saw no need to be ranked, only Nell was missing. The full lot of them had undergone transformation into Arankar at the Vasto Lord stage, elevating their powers beyond their peers. Their job would be to defeat Waiwaka's royal guard while Shiro handled Waiwak. Hashwalth glanced at Aizen's direction, clearly goading him into confrontation on the side, but Aizen didn't budge. The silence between the two stretched, but it meant little in the chaos ensued by the immediate clashing of the Espada and the Scoot Staffel. The only ones left remaining in their original places were Aizen and Shiro, and Waiwak, and Hashwalth. "What's wrong? You seem nervous." Shiro readied himself into a stance. "Nervous? No," Waiwak shook his head, a spiritual sword buzzing to life in his grasp. "Merely annoyed. Perhaps if you'd actually succeeded and destroyed the root of the Soul King's power, I would feel different, but all I see now is that it's been transferred to a new vessel I need only re-obtain." "A feat not so easy," Aizen replied firmly. Waiwak rolled his eyes, focusing on Aizen in disinterest. "What makes you believe you have the right to speak on this level? What gives me the right?" Aizen echoed mirthlessly. As the power swelled within him, his veins popped over his skin and his sclera shifted into a vibrant blue. He chuckled before it turned into a full-blown laugh. The time had come. Everything had reached this point, a culmination of all his efforts achieving fruition. Through patience he'd planned out each and every action. Through betrayal, he severed any lingering attachments or relationships. All of it was for this single moment. What did he want? What did he aspire for so strongly that he'd use anything at his disposal? To stand at the top? To usurp all the power for himself in order to dictate everything? Or perhaps was it simple vainglory? No. Not at all. For a man as driven as him, as motivated, as far-sighted, what he wanted was something simpler than a villain's coup de grace against his enemies. The sound of Aizen's bones grating echoed in his ears, but he hardly even reacted, too immersed and focused on the matter at hand. However, the pressure he exuded was enough that Waiwak shook his head at Hashwalth and signaled for him to aid the Scoot Staffel. Grimacing, Hashwalth complied as the energy surrounding Aizen began to compound at an accelerated rate. He was no savior or liberator. He would be no one's puppet, nor did he expect anyone to be. Waiwaka's intention of blurring the world lines was only a partial step towards the true goal. Even if the worlds were bound back together, and the balance maintained by the Shinigami undone, the new world would simply fall under Waiwaka's discretion. It would be no different from trading the current system of an inert Soul King with a fully conscious one. Rather than hoarding the power into a single source, he'd much rather disperse it freely into the world. Freedom. Was this single concept not what any sentient being yearned for? From the moment he was born, the limitations of what he'd become were already set. There was nothing to be done, no resistance to be made. It was only through innovation and research that something was born out of the stagnant waters that destabilized the order from the common mold. The Hogyaku. What made hollows different from Shinigami? What made humans the medium of both in the world of the living? Such questions always had roots in similarity. For example, the peak of a hollow's power, a Vasto Lord, more and more resembled the likeness of humans and the bladed weapons of Shinigami. In the same vein, a Shinigami's Bankai released the wild untamed elements of a hollow's chaotic energy to destroy. There was no such thing as a weak Bankai. Trial and error proved that without the limitations between humans, hollows, and Shinigami, a stronger being emerges. One need only look upon the Arankar, the Vizard, and even the Soul King himself, whose energies were a mix of all. The Soul King was the epitome of what the limits of the world were, but it was nothing more than a lifeless puppet enforced by a royal guard that was the equivalent of parasitic wardens. Indeed, to create a royal guard, one must consume the flesh of the king, a king that was inert in all senses of the word. Justice? Order? Balance? How ridiculous! It was nothing more than lies propagated since the era of the Soul Society's noble families. Aizen balled his hands into fists, his knuckles cracking as the spiritual energy around him reached its zenith and became unable to be sensed by Kisuk and the others. There would be no gods, no kings, no rulers that dictate the limitations of anyone. Aizen could never accept it, could never tolerate the illusion of the natural order, and this was reflected in who he was as a Shinigami. His Zanpakuto, the extension of his soul, spoke it all. Kyuka Suigetsu. Mirror flower, or water moon, was a representation of a mirage of the normalcy of the world broken to reveal the truth hidden beneath the surface. Right here. Right now. The tranquil illusion reflecting the pale moon over a still lake would be shattered. A cage would exist no longer. Only by seeking the pinnacle of power could Aizen be able to enact what must be done, at any cost. Aizen, I'm sorry. A voice whispered into Aizen's ears as the power within him reached an unbearable high. It threatened to burst him from within and reduce his physical form into spirit energy. Moreover, the one who'd been bearing the brunt of this pressure willingly was the very sword now fused to his hand. Second by second, Kyuka Suigetsu was losing its consciousness. With its fading, it would only be a matter of time for the rest of Aizen's soul to follow in its wake. Goodbye, dearest friend. Aizen figured that his body wouldn't be able to endure this overwhelming amount of spiritual energy. Possessing neither the blood of the Soul King, nor the constitution of the Vasto of White, his was a vessel of a mere Shinigami. Even with the supplementation of the Hogyaku, his body could only endure for so long, and yet it was in this state that he had no qualms releasing it. He thrust the blade in his hand outward, turning it clockwise like a key that shattered the void between worlds. Bankai, Kyuka Suigetsu, Kyaman, mirror face/reflections mirror. If Shikai could fool the senses of individuals, then Bankai could fool the senses of the world. Fake can become real, illusion and fantasy into reality. With the sound of shattering glass, the outcome of Aizen's body bursting into particles of spiritual energy under the strain of energy he was under was mitigated. He deceived the world into believing he had the qualification to act as a proper vessel. The energy and cost of this endeavor was unimaginable. Death was the simplest outcome by the end of this, and therefore he'd never resort to it until now. Be that as it may, he'd reached his goal, and all that was left was to make sure that his actions couldn't be reversed. Let no power fall into the hands of a single individual, trusting in the lack of ambition of the Vasto of White as a final fail-safe. For the first time, he'd devote his all into the throes of battle. You dash. Waiwaka's exclamation was cut off by the distinct screeching of spatial distortions. The moon will shatter. Aizen's eyes turned cold, his skin peeling to reveal blood bursting from the vessels beneath. Almost immediately, the damage was reversed, an illusion overlaid atop reality and forcibly altering it in a manner that was all too familiar to Shiro. The world will enter its twilight. Aizen had stepped onto the stage at the end of it all. The gilded cage will fall. Space fragments shattered, winds picking up into a storm. The ashes of a former world order will shift into ruins. Aizen's figure blurred between distinguishable and not. And from the desolation, Aizen stood with back straight, and with eyes clearer of any doubt than ever before, he nodded towards Shiro, trusting in the first partner he'd ever acknowledged as an ally in his life. The world is made anew. Chapter 72. There was no fanfare or idleness from the beginning. Instead, from the moment that Aizen had made his move, and the Espada rallied, there were no questions necessary to be asked. All that mattered was to defeat the enemies before them. There were 5, not counting Waiwak himself, who were viewed as targets that were wordlessly divided between combatants. Apasai clicked her tongue while using Sonido to step across the sky, gaze frowning while staring at the people around her. All of them were surrounding one enemy fully cloaked in a white robe that hid all discernible features. Pursing her lips, Apasai inwardly sighed at the situation. It was to be expected that Sung Sun and Mila Rose all had similar opinions, but fighting in this large of a group always felt stifling. There was no way Apasai thought herself weak, but it was more out of habit if anything. She'd always fought alongside Mila Rose and Sung Sun, and didn't question why they'd all move to attack a single enemy together, but what about him? Araniro, the hell you doing here? Apasai snarled indignantly at the one unexpected tag-along. It was bad enough to have 3 people attack a single person, but 4? Wouldn't they be bringing disgrace to Lady Haribol? Araniro, who'd appeared alongside Apasai, Mila Rose, and Sung Sun, hummed while readying himself for battle. You 3 looked like you'd need the most help, Araniro replied, pronged trident soon resting over his shoulders. Oh, piss off. Mila Rose grouched at the insinuation. Indeed, Sung Sun's eyes narrowed into slits, not at all pleased as long sleeves covered her mouth. You belittle us. Araniro sighed, giving his allies the stink eye. Damn it, shut up already and think. Do you really believe the others would want my help? Sung Sun, Apasai, and Mila Rose paused at the same time, the 3 subconsciously nodding in consideration. Lady Haribol wasn't one to readily accept help, and neither were Espada like Baragan, Ulquira, and Grimjo. Then there was Coyote, but her strength was already difficult to describe as an assimilation of Starkey, Lilynet, and Coyote herself. Not to mention, she wasn't an official Espada like Nell who would have accepted Araniro's help. Thinking further, people like Baragan were extremely likely to perceive Araniro's presence as a slight and may grow confrontational instead. As such, who was left if not the weak so fuck off? Apasai perked up moments after Sung Sun came to a frustrating deduction and whispered into both Apasai and Mila Rose's ears. Wait a second, you bastard. Apasai gnashed her teeth. Oh, what now? Araniro picked at his ears, eyes still carefully trained on the enemy before them who'd yet to make a sound or a move. Were you implying that we're weak? Mila Rose grimaced. Araniro looked away from the harping women without another word. Focus. He really couldn't understand how Haribol could put up with these 3, especially when they started bickering. Focus? It's not like this guy's done anything, Apasai gestured with her chin towards the white-robed member of Waiwaka's scout staffel. Doesn't even look like he can talk, let alone put up a fight. A pause occurred between combatants as they silently assessed each other. Even Mila Rose and Sung Sun put off glaring at Araniro in favor of watching their adversary's reaction. They weren't fools. To be one of the few Quincy allowed to fight by Waiwaka's side meant that this person was formidable. Would he or she show confidence? Scorn? Apprehension? The answer was nothing. Blowing wind was the only sound that came in response to Apasai's provocation. That, and a hair-raising rasp that sounded like high-pitched laughter. The cloaked man's name was Pernida Parncages, see the compulsory. His was a unique ability of thought and control, that no one present could have truly imagined. Then again, the air he suddenly began to give off was enough for Apasai, Sung Sun, Mila Rose and Araniro to tense. A pair of horn-like curved swords appeared in Apasai's grip, chukram with 3 blades protruding from each one. Mila Rose hefted her bastard sword while Sung Sun revealed the sai hidden within her sleeve. Najibana roared to life in Araniro's grasp, torrents of jetting water creating a fluid platform around him. In response, Pernida merely zipped down the top of his robe to reveal the figure beneath. An enormous pale-skinned left hand. 2 pupils and golden irises were visible in the large eye at the center of the palm, a feeling of eeriness swelling from around it. It was no wonder it couldn't speak. There wasn't even a mouth in sight. Heh, he's just a hand, Apasai snorted, letting out a small sigh of relief. She'd seen hollows far more fearsome in appearance. Almost as soon as Apasai had spoken, she felt the hair on the back of her neck raise when Pernita's pupils focused on her. Quickly, the index finger and ring finger curled, the thumb pulling back in a drawing motion before a quincy bow and arrow formed. Spiritual energy in the vicinity was all drawn towards the notched arrow, the power condensing to lethal levels that would surely pierce through any hardened arrow. Swallowing, Apasai, Sung Sun, and Mila Rose glanced at each other before immediately releasing their sealed states. They knew better than to be arrogant against a member of Waiwaka's Scoot's staffel. Resurrection. Thrust, Kierva. Brown fur covered Apasai's arms and legs, leaving only the skin of her navel and chest areas exposed. On her hand were prominent deer antlers several times sharper than when she was only in Ajichas. Blue and red stripped tribal markings formed curves on the underside of her breast and expanded out across her stomach. Strangle to death, Anaconda. A pink glow surrounded Sung Sun before hissing snakes emerged through the haze. A humanoid body was revealed, shoulders, forearms, and legs plated with gleaming reptilian scales. Where once, the entirety of her lower body was that of snakes, now, only a robust snake-head tail hissed from her back. Long sleeves still covered the base of her arms while 3 pink dots were lined beneath her left eye. Devour, Leona. Sturdy bone armor lined with a flowing lion's mane appeared over Mila Rose's head before extending to the rest of her body. Robust muscles and toned skin gave her the uncanny resemblance of an Amazonian warrior woman. An orange cross-shaped mark had also appeared over the bridge of her nose. Only Araniro remained in his sealed state out of consideration for his size in this sort of battlefield. Instead, Nijibana flowed with more currents of water that formed a protective shroud around him. Careful. All traces of ease left Araniro's features, Kyan's experiences, and honed battle senses leveling into a tranquil calm. As if we need you to say that. Mila Rose growled, lowering her stance and holding her sword in front of her. Apasai and Sung Sun lowered their center of gravity to move at a moment's notice. Apasai felt her heart racing, her blood pumping furiously within her. The sooner this battle was completed, the quicker she, Sung Sun, Mila Rose and even Araniro could provide support for Shiro. Their presence may not do much to change the situation, but even the smallest variables can become major. Kick his ass. Apasai roared before a buzzing echo revealed her speeding forward, pivoting with her feet in a circular maneuver. Sung Sun was quick to follow up, a pink glow revealing several large snakes that shot out of her sleeves. Mila Rose was more straightforward, choosing to engage in a melee, while Araniro began setting the stage with Nejibana's control of water. All of it, it was all meaningless. Hylig Bogan. The amassed power of Pernita's spiritual arrow diverted to its fingertips, revealing 5 smaller bows that attacked consecutively. Craning her neck to the right, Apasai winced from a small cut on the side of her cheek. She didn't want to believe it, but even against 4 people, Pernita's accuracy was monstrous. It was as expected of a bowman, but it didn't mean that Apasai didn't feel a chill travel down her back at the close shave. She startled, inwardly clapping herself to focus. Gather, mold, condense. A red zero began building at the center of her forward-facing horn, swirling with malefic energy. Sung Sun, Mila Rose. She called out, knowing that the other 2 would understand her intentions. Only one needed an audible cue. Araniro, block him. She growled. Almost instantly, orange joined Apasai's red zero, followed by pink from the heads of the snakes Sung Sun had launched forward. Around Pernita, the water that Araniro was releasing, ballooned into a hardened cage. No one thought it worth noting why Pernita wasn't even bothering to move. All that mattered to them was attacking. Aiming their zero towards Pernita trapped in a prison of water, Apasai, Mila Rose, and Sung Sun had little consideration for anything else. Stand in place and die, you damn cocky bastard. Apasai leveled her aim on Pernita, followed simultaneously by Sung Sun and Apasai. Zero. A shockwave burst out with them in the epicenter, adding to the mayhem of the spatial distortions already plaguing the battlefield. Covering her face from the debris with her arms, Apasai peeked over once the smoke cleared, and felt as if someone had just punched her in the gut. This blast had been the attack of 3 Vastolord-level Arankar. Logically speaking, there was no way anything could have survived, especially if it was arrogant enough to not even try to dodge. How is that thing still alive? Mila Rose's exclamation was the noise that broke the tentative silence. What? Scared Mila Rose. Apasai swallowed in alarm. Who's scared? You're the one whose teeth are chattering so loud that I can hear them from all the way over here, Apasai. Apasai's mouth clacked shut, choosing not to comment any longer. Sung Sun, in comparison to the other two, appeared paler than normal, her eyes dilated. That's disgusting. She sneered. Araniro swung Nijibana and cleared the water, obscuring the area around him. Pieces of pernita lay floating in the air. Some were charred and singed, while others resembled charcoal. However, all of them were squirming and pulsing like living flesh that collapsed in on itself and reformed into smaller hands. Not even hollows had this level of regenerative ability. Rather than high-speed regeneration, it was more like clones, equally powerful. Perhaps to begin with, it was never them that outnumbered the enemy, but the other way around. Sung Sun, Apasai, Mila Rose, and even Araniro felt dazed at the implication. Apasai. Sung Sun perked up and suddenly called in alarm. The searing feeling of bile running up her throat nearly had Apasai heaving, and this before the pain began to kick in. A severed finger had pointed in her direction and fired a condensed arrow through her stomach and out her back. Blood was seeping from her chest, dripping down over her furred legs, as she grudgingly realized the impact was moments away from making her fall. It was through sheer willpower that she remained in place, but not for long. Apasai. Sung Sun called out again. There was a second in which Apasai blinked, and in the next, the same finger that had fired a spiritual arrow at her was inches away from her face. Shit. The severed digit crashed against her and sent her careening through the sky under everyone's eyes. It was just too fast. No one had been able to react. No, it was their incredulousness that provided an opening. Damn, Apasai just got fingered, fuck, finger. Mila Rose called in warning, but again it was too late. Another severed digit streaked violently across the air and made impact. Araniro was blasted back in Apasai's direction, the look of scathing indignation he sent Mila Rose evident of how he felt for her slow warning. However, none of his frustration was voiced in favor of coughing out globs of blood. Only Sung Sun and Mila Rose were left behind to contend with the monster before them. Numerous reformed hands quickly covered Mila Rose and Sung Sun's field of view, each drawing closer and closer with notched spiritual arrows on each fingertip. Both women resisted the urge to shiver as they wordlessly glanced at each other and stiffly swallowed. Was it too late to switch opponents? Did she fail? Apasai blearily tried to open her eyes in the strong winds of her descent, but her injury shot down her ability to concentrate and control her spiritual energy to form a platform beneath her. As the winds blew fiercely over her face and swept up bangs of her hair, she was keenly aware that she was accelerating faster and faster. This fall was going to hurt. Shutting her eyes, she tried to sprawl her body in instinctual effort to use her own surface area to mitigate the speed of descent, but to no avail. She was going too fast, and was too hindered to make much of a difference. Red filled her vision, followed by an all-consuming black. What kind of monster had she been facing? Apasai knew that she was far from the strongest of Arankar in the lands of the Vasto of White, but she wasn't a pushover either. Her arrow would never be easily pierced, let alone broken by ordinary means. The spiritual energy contained in that one arrow hadn't even felt that overpowering. At most, it should have been able to wound her, not pierce her chest all the way through. It could have just been her, but glancing at her wound, pieces of flesh and mangled bone revealed more of a twisting motion than a penetrative one. Ah, damn it. None of what had happened made any sense. Balling her hands into fists, Apasai noticed her eyelids steadily closing until the embrace of unconsciousness eventually took her. At least she wouldn't feel the crunch of impact. Her world went dark, traces of what looked like orange light causing her brows to furrow when next she began to stir. The pain she should have been feeling over the new hole in her chest was oddly absent. Instead, a warm feeling was soothing her and calming her thoughts. She was alive? Blinking slowly, her heterochromatic eyes stared dumbly at the optimistic blues of what she could identify as a big-boobed, orange-haired human. "What?" she blurted out before shaking her head and abruptly sitting up, shattering the orange barrier that had admittedly been healing her. The moment the barrier shattered, the wounds not yet closed up, began bleeding once more. The only positive was that the new hole through her chest had been effectively sealed. Are you okay? It will take a bit more time for the other injuries you sustained to heal. Sorry, never mind. You can leave if you want." Apasai could care less about what the human was saying about her condition as she pushed herself away. She was too busy taking in the fact that her trajectory had careened her into landing on the Soul King's podium. The only two people she recognized as friendlies around her were Ichigo and Silent. The rest were either human or Shinigami, and with her opinion on them, she'd never feel comfortable in their care. Besides, there was no time. There was still a fight to get to. All too suddenly, a new figure came tumbling past, kicking up dirt and debris before the butt end of a trident was stabbed into the ground in a bid to slow momentum. Eren, did he get done in two? Apasai could no longer shake her feeling of unease. If Eren was launched here along with her, then what about Sung Sun and Mila Rose? Lady Haribel would be sad if any of them actually ended up dying. Needless to say, but obviously she couldn't care less if those two bitches died. Seriously, this was the truth, so why was she forcing herself? Whatever. The bastard just pissed me off. Limping, Apasai didn't bother glancing at Eren in order to focus on herself. With the primary injury to her chest healed, she could use her remaining spiritual energy as a crutch to keep her moving. Besides, anywhere was better than here where she could feel the eyes of the Shinigami bastards. The pitter-patter of blood droplets trickling down her skin before falling onto the tiles beneath her, echoed distinctly. She trudged on regardless, swaying somewhat with each step. Kisuke and the other Shinigami around him hardly paid attention to Apasai in favor of staring blankly at a panting Eren trying to steady himself. However, the same couldn't be said for those who actually knew and interacted with her prior. Hey wait! Ichigo called out, spurred out of his inaction at the sight of someone he knew practically on death's door. Be careful, you're bleeding. You should have seen your state before Orium started healing you. Apasai ignored Ichigo, teeth gnashing at though Ichigo believed he'd ever get her to agree to stay here. When Ichigo moved to support her when Apasai nearly tripped, rather than appreciate it, she rounded on him. Get out of my face, you asswipe. Apasai butted her head against Ichigo's, the horns of their mask fragments clanking in audible protest. Oh, Apasai cradled her head in silent regret, blood trickling down from a gash over her left eye. The further pain only served to further aggravate her more. The hell you trying to stop me for? At least I'm fighting. You're strong, aren't you? Lady Nell vouches for you, and here you are doing jack shit. I don't need your pity, or your concern, you coward. Apasai shoved Ichigo away, panting deeply before glaring into a direction she'd been blasted away from. Buzz. A burst of sonito, and Apasai was gone, leaving a brooding Ichigo with an ache pulsating over his forehead, and Silent who was shaking her head at her son's waning resolve. In any case, only Ichigo could find the answer, a reason, to fight for himself. With Apasai gone, this left only Eren who wished to be anywhere else but here. Of course, the sight of Yukatake being healed under the Zanpakuto spirit's light left him warm-hearted and relieved, but it was precisely because of these feelings that he refused to stay. Honestly, he'd been avoiding interacting with Kisuke and the others for a reason, and one of them was stubbornly rearing its head. Before Eren could even think to flash step away, his actions were seen, interpreted, and then effectively denied. Kion, wait. A pair of arms wrapped around Eren waist, anchoring him down in a way that no spiritual pressure ever could. Ignoring the sting of his injuries, Eren could feel the wetness of tears staining the white espada attire he was wearing. A woman was clinging to him. Having seemingly moved at a speed faster than even a captain's, she was the first to arrive in a blur of motion. Following her, but too unsure of whether to join, was a rugged-faced man wearing a green bandana. Kyokaku, Ganju, the names escaped Eren mouth, something that he'd been fighting with from deep within him, slowly coming to the surface. Kion. It's you. I don't know how Aizen's forcing you, but you don't have to fight anymore, goddammit. Kyokaku grouched, sniffling while glaring all the same, daring him to protest or contradict her. Under Kisuk's lead, many Shinigami had followed the path to the Soul King's podium. It was safer here from all the fighting, and under Anohana's instructions, the patients she was caring for were also brought over. For safety's sake, this also included those seeking refuge with the Shinigami, hence the presence of humans and ordinary souls present. Hence, Kyokaku and Ganju's presence. In fact, they were better off than normal pluses that stumbled under Shinigami rescue from the Rokanga. Kyokaku, I need you to let go dash. Bullshit. Not happening. Ganju, get his legs. Ganju, what did I tell you about indulging your sister? Ganju. Ganju. Ganju, I'll skin you. Hurry and listen to me. Ganju, brothers, or hoes. The fuck you just call me? A strange feeling of deja vu occurred between Ichigo and Karen while watching the scene of the Shiba siblings squabbling while looking as if they were on the verge of crying. They glanced at each other, thought of their own situation where they thought Ichigo had died, huffed, and then looked away. Erineiro's mouth closed when he realized he was getting nowhere. This was stupid. He too had reached Vasto Lord level in the time he'd spent in the land of the Vasto of White. This should have meant better control of his abilities and power, but instead, the purity of the spiritual energy he'd absorbed, further stirred the changes already within him. Feeling helpless, Erineiro's gaze wandered towards a familiar face in the haziness of the memories he'd absorbed from the Shinigami known as Kai and Shiba. Is that you, uncle? Ishine didn't know how to respond, but it didn't end up mattering as he was unceremoniously pushed aside by his own daughter. Hey, he looks like Ichigo, Karen muttered while pulling on Ishine's sleeve. That's because he, and his brother and sister, are your cousin, Ishine replied stiffly. I was the one who took care of them when I was still a captain in the Siraidii. And that's why you know us best, uncle. Erineiero flashed a shaky smile with Kyan's face. Mind helping me? Kyokaku always did listen to you after the old man and woman passed on. As if the words of an uncle who ran out on us mean shit to me anymore, Kyokaku pursed her lips and fought against Erineiero trying to pry her off. You're not going anywhere, Kyan. I listened last time, but not this time. Aizen has no hold over you, dammit, stop fighting me. Half-heartedly, a stream of water flowed its way between the gaps of Kyokaku's hold, and eventually pried her loose. Not expecting Kyan to go to the extent his Zanpakuto on her, Kyokaku stared blankly. Kyokaku, Ganju, Erineiero muttered, his thoughts indiscernible. There's something I still need to do, so I can't stay here. I'm just thankful that my captain seems like he'll pull through. Jushiro's a tough one, rest at ease, Shunsui spoke up, tipping his hat. Now if only Yukatake were awake to see and talk with former lieutenant thought dead. That I will, but for now, I must go. Erineiero didn't feel like staying any longer. The way he was being stared at, and more importantly, the unknown feeling swelling from within him, wasn't something that he wished to indulge. He was the one in control, Erineiero. Not some absorbed personality. Suddenly, he winced, Nejibana's waters caressing his side almost comfortingly. Don't think about it. Just get out. Leave. Erineiero steeled his resolve and began walking. Kisuk and the other captains didn't stop him. They couldn't say that they understood Kyan's motives, but they didn't question him either. The look on his face was one that Ichigo often made when he was determined. Something that the present Ichigo was surely lacking at this moment. Erineiero paused, noticing Ichigo at the corner of his eyes and recalling him to be someone affiliated with Nell. Lo and behold, a recuperating Nell was being watched after by him. Still, did it excuse not joining in on the decisive battle? Ichigo was clearly hesitating, and the Shiba within Erineiero began to act up. Let me give you a tip, little cousin. Erineiero suddenly patted Ichigo by the shoulder. Questioning yourself will just lead you nowhere. Is this where I belong? Am I in a nightmare? Who are my enemies? What grudges are worth holding onto? Who am I? In the end, what matters is instinct. Yes. That's it exactly. It's enough so long as it's worth lifting your sword up. For the life of him, Ichigo couldn't tell if the advice was spoken more for him, or for Kyan himself. Eriniro let go of Ichigo's shoulder and moved to flash step after a passai, yet paused at the last second. Kyokaku, Ganju. Don't look at me like that. I can tell what you want to say even without looking, Kyan said in passing. Big bro can't kick the bucket yet. Ganju, watch after your sister. She's only as tough as she wants you to think, and, I'm proud of you both. The Shiba name will live on. Enemy or ally, I at least know where this trident is pointed. Ichigo stilled at the words, and suddenly Eriniro was gone while a past conversation absently flittered through Ichigo's mind. Nell, what do you think of the Vasto of White? Glancing in the direction of his own sword, Ichigo frowned. Heh. For hollows with no heart, his would no doubt be bigger than most. Without taking into account future repercussions, in what direction was his sword facing? Please help him if you're able. All this land of blades in Hueco Mundo, it was all thanks to him. He sucked in a breath, trusting Nell with Orium. I believe in you, Ichigo. These words were enough. This bastard isn't even taking us seriously. Mila Rose cursed while cutting a hand in half, only for said hand to split into two smaller hands pointing spiritual arrows at her. This had occurred so many times already that she had long since lost count. The more you cut, the worse this gets, Sung Sun complained, shifting through a hail of holy arrows and opting to swallow the formed hands with her snakes. That's why your style lacks class, Mila Rose. Snorting, Mila Rose didn't have the heart to snap back in the way she normally did at provocation. Seeing Milrose not rise to the jab, it made the two almost miss a passai. However, the two were too occupied trying to remain alive to search for the outcome of their friend. This is never going to end. Mila Rose felt her muscles screaming in fatigue, cuts and bruises lining her skin while Sung Sun was no better. All around the two, more and more hands just kept forming while Pernida simply remained aloofly in place, paying more attention to where Waiwak, Shiro, and Aizen were fighting. Complaining already? A voice caused both Sung Sun and Mila Rose's ears to perk up. You'd disappoint Lady Haribel, finished a panting Apasai, blood staining her form. Apasai. I knew a cockroach was tough to kill. Mila Rose chuckled, eyeing Apasai up and down and noticing that the hole she'd seen through Apasai's chest had miraculously healed over. Say, that again. I'll kill you, you stupid cat. The two ignored Apasai's rebuttal and focused on her instead. High-speed regeneration? It was unlikely, neither Mila Rose or Sung Sun knew Apasai to have that ability, but they wouldn't kick a gift horse in the mouth. Cutting and destroying these things isn't worth it, Sung Sun grimaced. We need to blast this bastard all at once. Apasai, Mila Rose, let's do it. Yeah. Fine. You think this bastard would let us? Apasai narrowly dodged several spiritual arrows that had immediately shot at her, many ignoring Sung Sun and Mila Rose. I think he hates me, she complained. Then again, Apasai was the one who had been antagonistic from the start. Idiot, pay attention, Apasai. A finger arrow was pointed at her once again. Apasai clenched her jaw, recalling how familiar this situation was and immediately diving forward to dodge, uncaring of her image. However, the weakness of her injuries dulled her reaction speed. Despite moving, the arrow would still hit her kidney area. No matter how she thought about it, there would be no second miracle of a human nursing her back to a fighting condition. Shit. She really should have just left her mouth shut in hope that she wouldn't draw the monster's attention. Right now, though, it was too late for regrets. She shut her eyes, and braced herself for more pain, only to stare dumbly at the figure who'd speedily arrived and hoisted her away like a sack of potatoes. Who were you calling an asswipe? Look who's getting their ass wiped instead. Ichigo grinned provocatively at Apasai. Apasai grunted, but couldn't bring herself to admit that she was thankful for the save. Shut up and just make yourself useful. Buy us some time. She pushed off Ichigo and drifted towards Mila Rose and Sung Sun. Ichigo shrugged, but was inwardly confused. Where was Kyan? Didn't he leave first? He mulled to himself. Focusing on the task at hand, Ichigo simply used his sheer speed and capabilities of his current form to intercept and block each arrow aimed at Apasai and the others until it was no longer necessary. Quimera Parka. Apasai, Sung Sun, and Mila Rose tore off their left arms in a manner identical to what they did in the Siriti. The arms blurred and formed together in a rapidly expanding embryo that matured at a rapid pace. A head appeared with two long antlers stemming from the deer skull at its center. Sleek and pale, those antlers jutted out from the left and the right and branched out into sharp ends. Pale yellow eyes could be seen just beneath the antlers, the entire head covered in a mane of thick and coarse fur. There was a silence as the figure fully appeared, heralded by an explosion of spiritual pressure that flattened the area into level ground. If Ichigo recalled from memory, then what would happen next was Ayon. Blast M. A towering giant opened its mouth, gathering spiritual energy from all around it. Born through the combined strength of three Vastolord-level Arrancar, the intensity of the Zero it was forming rivaled that of Coyotes. In a hair-raising response, Pernida finally perked up and shifted its gaze away from Waiwak, Shiro, and Aizen, and onto Ayon. Is that all? Pernida finally spoke for the first time. Its voice was a strange mix of childishness and eerie chittering. Size does not matter. As if the Quincy was finally taking the matter seriously, Pernida pointed several fingers in Ayon's direction and launched a volley of something that clearly wasn't just some ordinary spirit arrow. Confident in his strength and power, Ayon never thought of dodging to begin and focused on gathering power into its Zero. It was a fatal and tragic mistake. To begin with, Pernida really hadn't been taking the fight seriously until now. See the compulsory. All at once, the objects Pernida had launched appeared to be squirming nerve cells. Stabbing into Ayon's flesh, they burrowed and created a branching network that wrestled control of bodily function from Ayon. Ayon seemed to hum in confusion as its body abruptly froze, the Zero it was forming, immediately dissipating. What? Apasai's stupor was mirrored by her compatriots. I thought you said you had this handled. Ichigo grimaced. Ayon's stronger than everyone here, there's no doubt. That bastard's just cheating. Mila Rose grumbled. Ayon, hurry, and kill him before it's too late. An eerie laughter echoed as Pernida played with the notion of controlling Ayon to forcibly attack its own creators, but thought better of using something so barbaric. It was better to remove it from sight. Ayon's lumbering body sagged, a howl of agony escaping its mouth as it began to forcibly bend and turn. Twisting as if wringing out a wet rag, Ayon was torn into shreds, large fragments splattering over the landscape. Be a dump, be a dump. Apasai, Mila Rose, and Sung Sun glanced at each other with equal levels of growing panic. Unlike Haribel, and the others, they hadn't unlocked a second release. This level of an enemy, they couldn't handle it. They really couldn't without Ayon. He was their trump card, but their enemy's power rendered it mute. Moreover, there was a chilling premonition that this wasn't even the best Pernida had to offer. Unknown to the three creators, but Ayon was far from truly dead. In a different time, if Ayon had been born from the powers of three Ajich's level Arrancar, its power and regenerative abilities wouldn't have been enough to keep it conscious. However, in this case, Ayon was created through the offering of three Vastolord-level Arrancar. Despite its remains being scattered across a vast distance, some semblance of sentience remained in a glob of its brain matter which crashed into a hillside. Quickly, it condensed into a smaller 8-foot-tall humanoid form that retained much of Ayon's power. Nevertheless, it remained sprawled in the hill of swords in which it had cratered into, roaring and howling in fury. The only motivation it had other than murdering its enemies, was the protective affection it felt for its mothers. With almost childlike reasoning, it understood that it couldn't win without a weapon. The nerves launched at it, couldn't be blocked by flesh and bone. Fight. Fight. For mother. Ayon's sleeker form gradually pushed itself up onto its feet, sensing the fear building up in Apasai, Sung Sun, and Mila Rose's hearts through their blood connection. Crush enemy into dirt. Suddenly, a rock-like obsidian sword fell towards Ayon from the edge of the crater it had formed on its landing. From a glance, the stone sword didn't appear to be anything special, but it just so happened to be the right size for Ayon's current height. Ayon didn't know what came over it, but it saw a weapon, and it didn't care if it was ownerless or not. However, the moment Ion's hand grasped over the hilt, everything changed. For all its power, it suddenly felt small, dwarfed by an even larger presence shrouded in potent rage. To begin with, no sword that existed within this space was ownerless, and in some manner, the sword began to resonate. Within Ion's bleary and simple consciousness, the image of a towering stone-skinned-like giant appeared, a mane of long flowing hair at its back. Those eyes appeared to be staring right through Ion's core, testing him, scrutinizing him, until finally, a nod. Then, hazy blackness blurred Ion's sentience as the clarity of the giant's eyes soon reflected over Ion's. The giant seemed to relate with something about Ion. More than anything, beyond the murderous rage shrouding everything in madness, the will to protect remained. This alone was enough to lend its aid. The towering obsidian sword was drawn from the hill. Pressured by the aura and incomprehensible manner in which Ion was torn into bits, Apasai, Mila Rose, and Sung Sun gradually backed away. Ichigo warily raised his own sword up in defense, and yet the impossible occurred. A boom reverberated in the distance, followed by supersonic winds that abruptly halted directly in front of Apasai, Mila Rose, and Sung Sun. An 8-foot-tall giant wordlessly appeared, much to Pernita's inner disbelief. It thought that it had killed this thing already. Ion. Sung Sun called out softly. No response. If not for the connection Sung Sun and the others could feel tying them to the figure shielding them, it was really too hard to relate this sleeker figure with Ion's original towering form. At the very least, the snake tail, deer fur, and lion's mane on the figure's body were distinct enough markers. Was that an axe sword? Where did he get that? No. That wasn't the point right now, Sung Sun mulled. Sung Sun's pupils dilated when she noticed Pernita absently point its fingers at Ion to launch the same nerve cells again. Knowing how stupid or absent-minded Ion could be, and that Ion was their only chance at victory, Sung Sun and the others could hardly keep still. What was the point of him coming back if he just died from the same attack? Watch out! Sung Sun yelled in warning. Don't let those touch, yo, you. Her voice trailed off. Clang. Faster than the eye could blink, the sword wielded in Ion's hands batted aside all projectiles without fail. Was it a coincidence? The pupils within Pernita's eyes focused on the peculiar change in its adversary. This time, Pernita's nerves weren't simply shot from itself, but also from the fingertips of its clones flying around, leaving no room to maneuver. Bang! Clang! Ting! The same result occurred. A solid defense. Not a single nerve managed to penetrate through Ion's web of sword strikes. Slack-jawed silence ensued, broken only by the sound of sudden unbridled pride and excitement. That's my boy. You all see that? All from me. Apasai murmured in a daze. I made that. It went to show just how affected Sung Sun and Mila Rose were that they didn't even register Apasai's unfounded claim. If anything, they had just as much of a claim. The change was all too surreal. Make mommy proud. Chapter 73. The pressure in the air was such that Ichigo could feel goosebumps forming over his skin, but at the same time, a sense of inexplicable trepidation. A chill traveled down his back as he stared upon the smaller form of whatever Apasai, Sung Sun, and Mila Rose had created. The very area around it differed from all else. It was heavy and thick with tension. Ion. This was the name Ichigo had heard Apasai, Mila Rose, and Sung Sun call out prior, but the feeling now was entirely different from before. It was more controlled, more refined even, despite possessing a bestial wildness that bordered on monstrous. Partly it had to do with the sword Ion was wielding, giving off what no one else knew was a divine aura from the Zanpakuto spirit possessed within it, but mostly because the energy was above their level of existence to sense. Therefore, what could only be felt was an underlying sensation of suppression and awe from a higher state of being. Ion's mothers loved it, sparkles forming in their eyes, the wellspring beginnings of maternal pride and ego inflating their perspectives. The area was heated with a kind of primal ferocity and presence that sooner or later snapped Sung Sun and Mila Rose out of their daze enough to finally register Apasai's vain boasts. However, the words of protest and criticism about to escape their lips were silenced by the chilling wind of steadily increasing spiritual energy. Ichigo's countenance grew muddled, lips twisting into a frown as he shielded his face from the onsetting storm. An odd humming noise was echoing out from around Pernida. Perhaps due to lacking a mouth, Pernida resorted to creating vocal frequency with the spiritual energy around it. Interesting, Pernida spoke in that same disembodied voice. It was like the sound of scratching sandpaper, or the screeching of chalk on a blackboard. Ha. The eeriness of Pernida's chuckling was disturbing in its own right, but what Pernida did next caused everyone to narrow their eyes. Pernida's spiritual energy rose sharply as the very same nerve bundles it had shot into Ion's larger form prior began to radiate with heat and light. Beyond the miracle granted to Pernida from Wywak, Pernida himself had his own unique abilities. As the former left hand of the Soul King, Pernida was made entirely of the power and flesh that the royal guard prided themselves on to pass through the Soul King Palace's barriers. This granted him heightened defense and physical ability, but more than that was the type of existence that the Soul King was as this world's very anchor. An information relay with knowledge of all things in the domain. The Soul King was both everywhere and nowhere at all, making the conceptualization of his being rather arbitrary in a sense. Pernida as the Soul King's left hand inherited this uniqueness to encompass and accept all. Beyond the power of see the compulsory, two abilities were Pernida's primary strength aside from his anatomical manipulations. Organic evolution, followed by adaptive replication. These two skills were exactly what Pernida intended to demonstrate as the divide between it and the lower rabble. Through adaptive replication, Pernida could absorb and mimic information from objects. Through organic evolution, Pernida could consume and gain the abilities, traits, and aspects from biomass. There was no opponent that he could not defeat in time. As for Ion's biomass and spiritual energy in its giant form, Pernida had plenty to work with. "What's it doing?" Ichigo whispered to the person nearest to him, namely Araniro. Rather than answer, a strangely pensive expression crossed Araniro's face when he noticed Pernida consuming Ion's prior body mass. The process and the outcome were exceedingly familiar with him. "Get ready," was all Araniro could say in warning. "Bastards like me?" Araniro's words completely went over Ichigo's head, but not Apasai, Sung-sun, and Mila Rose who understood the implication. He's eating my baby boy." Apasai's eyes went bloodshot, Sung-sun and Mila Rose grabbing her by the arm before she could give Pernida a piece of her mind literally. Sung-sun and Mila Rose had no illusion that Pernida would quickly overpower Apasai and may even absorb her too, let alone her brain matter. The only one seemingly unaffected by developments was Ion's sleeker form. Pernida's strength may have risen in accordance to Ion's own, but there were certain properties that weren't copied. Namely, the power and legend of the noble phantasm in Ion's hand aiding him in battle. The aspect of divinity beyond the bounds of souls wasn't something that could be easily gleaned or recreated even through Pernida's adaptive replication. For what it was worth, the many nerves Ion batted away with the axe sword in defense of those behind him, merely accessed the composition of the axe sword's make and nothing else. It was made of stone. It was black, a shade of obsidian. Special properties? The sides were blunt, and the jagged edge capable of tearing through flesh and crushing bone regardless of sharpness. In this case, it wasn't the sword that was unique, but the wielder that wielded the power of its legend that mattered. A weapon was only as good as the person wielding it, and Ion was no longer the same as he was before. In fact, Ion was now more of an auxiliary than a main component in the build, fueling a new concept known only by the name of noble phantasm. Legends that span throughout the history of man, crystallized to embody the words and feats of stories past. Yes, myth and lore were the conduit, the match, and the fuse. The mountain stands firm, attested to the task of 12 labors thought impossible yet accomplished regardless. Unwavering tenacity. Unrelenting ferocity. He who possessed the blood of gods would need a divine mystery of the same level to even affect him. Ion could feel the presence of a steady presence enshrouded in madness influencing his actions, but even still, it felt right. In this blinding rage coursing through Ion's veins, one purpose remained through the haze. Kick his ass. Mommy's watching behind you. No hesitation. Feel it. Let the means crystallized in the words passed down through man, manifest here. Death is not the end, but the beginning. Ion continued to bat several of Pernida's attacks, until finally, he just stopped and let them smash against his chest as a primal roar escaped his mouth. Ting! Ting! Clang! What kills you once, will no longer kill you again. It was like hitting steel with flimsy needles. Magic energy pulsed into Aion through his grip on the axe sword, his skin shifting to a tinted gray, the whites of his eyes flashing red. God Hand, the noble phantasm of the myth of the hero Heracles, wielder of the sword in Aion's hand, and a manifestation of the Zanpakuto spirit held within. Through the power enacted in this ability, the user's body was akin to a divine class conceptual armor. Methods that killed him once, would no longer be able to kill him again for a total of 11 deaths, representing the monumental achievement of the 12 labors of Greek mythology. What was the first word out of everyone's mouths as they watched all of Pernita's ranged attacks bounce right off of Aion's body. It was only after Pernita stopped shooting and willed various hands to tear Aion apart physically that Aion even reacted. Even then, after seemingly getting the upper hand and fatally wounding Aion by stabbing through him with blunt force, the same tactic no longer worked. What started Pernita more than it was willing to admit, was that even the gift granted to him by Waiwak, the compulsion, was met with the same level of resistance while trying to kill Aion in a similar manner as his larger form. Yet this was impossible. None could deny the ability of the miracle granted upon him. What even was this? For the first time, a trace of doubt flickered across Pernita's eye. Don't underestimate it because it was just a hand, but it learned quickly as it analyzed Aion in battle. One aspect stood out among the rest: it was practically impossible to kill Aion in the same way twice. You, annoying, Pernita rasped, shifting its strategy, only to be met with hand pressing down on its main body and dragging it across a nearby wall of the former Soul King's palace. Blood ruptured and stained the white tiles, cracked and crumbling. It was barbaric. A direct show of physical strength and might, and Mila Rose was smiling so wide in pride and glee that her fangs were showing. For the rest spectating, there was a simple conclusion that everyone inferred identical to Pernita's own thoughts. No one knew how, including Apasai, Sung Sun, and Mila Rose, but Aion would no longer die the same way twice. A newly developed power? See. Apasai abruptly felt her heart hammering rapidly in her chest despite nearly being blown away from the shockwave of Aion and Pernita clashing. That tenacity and vitality is all me. Me. A tick mark formed over Sung Sun's brow, her eyes narrowing into slits before berating Apasai with a hiss. All you? Do you not see the grace of Aion's movements, the elegant flair of his sword? That's obviously me, she spoke snidely from the side, having regained her composure under Aion's protection. Mila Rose blinked. Bullshit, what elegance. As if you bitches can't see the sheer ferocity and power in his strikes that neither of your puny muscles could generate. That's clearly from me. Apasai growled, butting heads with the other two and all trying to pull at each other's hair just to prove a point. Well, I have the good traits, you see that sleek pelt around his legs. Apasai snapped, Sung Sun's hand irritably pulling at her cheek. That's me, exactly like my fur. He even has my horns and my temperament. I give the best traits. No, my muscles. Do either of you even have an 8-pack beneath your flab? Mila Rose shoved Apasai's face away, and irked Sung Sun with the jab. How uncouth, you barbarians, seeing yet blind, Sung Sun strained while trying to push both Mila Rose and Apasai's heads down. My Aion's best traits are my style, my figure, my agility, and my sophistry. Damn snake, you're sick in the head. You're the one who's blind. Apasai and Mila Rose growled simultaneously, pushing up against Sung Sun's tyranny. Hey, stop pulling my hair. Stop trying to scratch my eyes out. Bitch. No, you. Fuck, you're both just jealous that I'm best mom. In the distance a short way from Aion and Pernita clashing, a figure suddenly felt somewhat lost as the behavior of the other three began to devolve. What are they doing? Ichigo stammered in shock, unable to comprehend how they can bicker in the midst of this all. I know they created that monster, but shouldn't they know better? A hand suddenly patted Ichigo's shoulder from behind him. Kion. Araniro's features were stiff with shame, unable to even look Apasai, Sung Sun, and Mila Rose's way and wincing. For your sake cousin, don't bother. Araniro advised almost exasperatedly before his features grew stern. We have bigger things to consider, like how to tip the scales. Araniro spectated the ensuing clash of Ayon and Pernida below with a critical eye. Ayon would slice apart Pernida whenever he got close, but each time Pernida was halved, he'd replicate into several more bodies in a never-ending cycle. In the same vein, Pernida tried to obtain God Hand, but found that the nerves he'd stuck to Ayon and the axe sword itself didn't have this property to even copy. What Pernida didn't understand was that it was conceptual, derived from lore. Hence, Pernida had no choice but to find other methods to kill Ayon 11 more times. The problem was, Ayon wasn't just going to stand there and take it. Brushing the bottom of his chin, Araniro soon nodded to himself before shifting his attention back to Ichigo. Those two seem balanced, and if we can help somehow, we can win and aid the others. Araniro advised before considering how Ichigo could be of help to him. Listen, there's something that I want to try. Can you help dash? Araniro's voice was suddenly drowned out all at once. Beat the shit out of him. Best mommy's rooting for you. Apasai's voice directly cut Araniro off, the three still squabbling yet presently united in this single aspect. Oh, shut up, Apasai, Ayon, crush him. Mila Rose hollered, grabbing the other two into headlocks, but missing Sung Sun, who slipped away. Taking a breath, Sung Sun raised a sleeve to cover the lower half of her face, pride and elation at Ayon's battle power surging. Always so crass, the both of you, ahem. Ayon, fucking kill that cunt. Silence. Apasai and Mila Rose blinked as they turned towards Sung Sun, who stared olishly at them, pressing her sleeve covering her mouth closer to her lips as the tops of her cheeks tinged red. What? Never seen an elegant woman before. Ichigo felt stunned, not by the three anymore, but by how used to all this Kaien appeared. Like I was saying, Araniro said flatly, choosing to ignore the other three. I need your help, cousin. Gradually, Ichigo nodded. // This was insane. No, actually, that was just Ichigo's common sense talking, but even he felt some form of trepidation when his cousin Kaien subtly moved to apprehend one of Pernida's cut-off appendages. There was a small delay in which Pernida's cut part squirmed and writhed before ballooning up into a perfect replica of Pernida himself, but it was the moment Kaien was waiting for. Ichigo, now. I know, I heard already. Ichigo grumbled. Ichigo's speed was far faster than Araniro's, and he was also reasonably a lot more powerful in his present state as a horned hollow. Therefore, the favor Kaien had in mind was for him to get into a position to apprehend one of Pernida's squirming pieces cut off by Ayon while Kaien finished his preparations. Was this really going to work? Without wasting any more time, Ichigo put aside his sword and wrestled the forming bag of flesh in his grip while pressing it down with his spiritual energy. The way it writhed and bubbled felt like he was holding a ball of worms. Ichigo, to tell you the truth, I developed a new ability as a hollow that lets me absorb the power of others. The ability devours much like this thing can. I'd like to give it a try, even a small part of him will do. Kaien had explained that he was like Ichigo, being part hollow after his hollowification. The only difference being that he acquired a skill in the process. You know that this guy can absorb powers too, right? Araniro didn't answer. To him, it was always a battle of wills, and he was no stranger to wrestling control within himself for the position of main conscience. This shouldn't be any different, and something about the prospect of consuming part of Waiwaka's spiritual energy granted to Pernida tickled at his ability's insatiable hunger. But that means I'd get strong enough to make a difference if I team up with that Ayon guy. Ichigo frowned before he shook his head. If you're going to try, just hurry up. This thing's disgusting and it won't be long before it gains control of itself. My pleasure, cousin. Araniro quickly finished his preparations and aimed his hand at Ichigo, who was holding the piece of Pernida in place. Now move. Ichigo didn't have to be told twice. Using his spiritual pressure to keep the writhing mass in place, he flash-stepped away before white hollow tentacles stretched out from Araniro's hand. Wrapping around the piece of Pernida, Araniro immediately activated his core ability. Gluten area, devour. A pulse echoed within Araniro's mind as the telltale signs of a surge in power entering him caused his lips to tug upward. However, the moment was short-lived. Araniro widened his eyes. Fool, you, actually, wish to absorb one of me? Me. Damn fucker, just hurry and die. You have no power here, Araniro muttered under his breath, focusing his all into his devouring ability. It was a battle of wills concerning all of the absorbed personalities within Araniro against Pernida. Veins popped over Araniro's skin, many bursting and splattering blood over his features everywhere before his knees began to wobble. He staggered, panting for breath, as the expression on his face grew fiercer and fiercer. Kion. Great, now what? Araniro craned his head to the side, only to see several spirit arrows coming his way. Apasai, Milarose, and Sung Sun were one thing, but Ayon showed no real regard for protecting anyone else. Ichigo moved to defend. Wielding his sword, he pressed his forearm over the flat of the blade and began bouncing the attacks elsewhere. It felt as if he could handle the situation, his eyes tracking all the projectiles before him, but then reality began to hit that there was no end in sight. Kion, how long is this going to take? Rather than answer, Araniro spat out blood, his eyes practically rolling to the back of his head as he keeled over, having nearly lost his footing. Fuck. Me? Lose? Impossible. Never. Araniro gnashed his teeth, inwardly seething while balling his hands into fists. Unfortunately, while the battle raged inside him, physically, his body was breaking down. Finally, no longer able to support himself, Araniro tumbled forward while Ichigo continued defending him. Damn it! Before Araniro could start plummeting to the ground, he was roughly picked up like a sack of potatoes. Idiot, Apasai muttered as she appeared, hauling Araniro's ass to safety while the man in question groaned from the internal battle he was facing. Turning towards Ichigo, Apasai yelled. A swipe. Follow me. My baby boy don't give no shit about you, but it won't matter if you're next to us. Apasai grunted and used Sonido before shifting her attention back on the greedy bastard beside her. Have you never heard about not swallowing poison? Weakly, Araniro glared up before simply grunting out with much difficulty. Fuka, ugh, off. His voice came disjointed, an odd mix of everything he'd consumed so far. A tick formed over Apasai's forehead. Her temper had always been short-fused. Dipshit, I'll drop you, you just watch me. You're basically dying in there and you have the nerve to backtalk. Silence. Araniro no longer responded, too focused inwardly on himself, and unwilling to think of the consequence should he lose this inner war. Ha, fool, Apasai spat, frowning, but she did ease her grip around the areas where she could see Araniro injured from ruptured blood vessels. If you asked Ichigo, Apasai was being considerate, but if you asked Apasai, she'd immediately say that she just didn't want a weakling's blood on her. Both were debatable, but nonetheless useless in contributing to any meaningful strategy. Apasai pursed her lips while glancing back to where Ayon and Pernida continued fighting. It was a simple case of helpless in the situation that put a damper on everyone's mood. Each blow from the combatants produced shockwaves that forced everyone else nearby to hunker down and shield their faces from Ayon and Pernida's clashing. Damn monster! There's no way he beats Ayon. Apasai muttered under her breath. The situation was going nowhere, and quickly. Worse, no one knew how long Ayon could maintain his level of power and skill given that Pernida didn't seem to tire. Not wasting time, Apasai adjusted Araniro and hurried back to where Sung Sun and Milarose were, Ichigo trailing behind as they endured the pressure together. Although they were safe as a group now, it didn't change the fact that they had to do something to tip the scales. It was in this state of helplessness that an almost calculated and timely intervention intervened. Seems like you are all having trouble. This voice? There was no one who couldn't recognize it, both friend and foe alike. Oi, it's that Aizen bastard. Milarose grumbled, searching if he was anywhere nearby but finding nothing. What do you want? As if we need your help. How are you even talking to us? I am everywhere, yet not. The world is my domain between the bounds of illusion and reality. Apasai's lip twitched irritably, her hands throwing Araniro into Sung Sun's grip before she yelled into the air. Get to the point. Impatient and impertinent are we, very well. I'm here to give you all a hint. The area fell silent. It was certainly true that Apasai, Mila Rose, Sung Sun, and Ichigo found themselves in an impasse in this battle, but to the extent of asking help from Aizen? Apasai and Mila Rose immediately made faces of consternation, whilst Sung Sun sighed heavily just imagining what Lady Haribel would think. Still, this battle wasn't just about pride or pettiness. This was for Lady Haribel and Shiro's future. A hint. Sung Sun asked while clicking her tongue. That woman you call Silent, you will need her. Research and observation of data from the Quincy's first encounter with her indicate an anomaly. She is the Zero. Silent was a name that everyone who stayed in the Vasto of White's lands knew, at least from hearsay from the invasion of Soul Society, or personally for those close to her. Ichigo was no exception, just that it took him longer to process Aizen's words. Silent, isn't that hey what the hell do you mean? I mean that in a literal sense, obviously. The oddities and anomalies surrounding her make her the key pawn against Quincy. The antithesis. Her presence alone should be enough whether she's aware of it or not. No, Ichigo immediately denied, quickly understanding what Aizen was implying that they do. It's up to you whether you trust me or not, but do you all really have the luxury of doubt, let alone those around you? Aizen was right, everyone on scene was growing pensive. Pernito was a Quincy that could use the spiritual energy around him to refuel himself if need be. Then there was also his unique power and abilities that allowed him to replicate information gleaned from his nerves or consumed. Aion may be strong, but given enough time, Aion's body wouldn't last. None knew this better than Aion's mothers, who contributed the flesh and energy to create Aion. Gradually, Apasai glanced down in the direction of the Soul King's podium, followed by Mila Rose, while Sung Sun appeared deep in thought. This was an action that Ichigo didn't miss, but he also knew who was the more impulsive of the three. He flash-stepped, appearing next to Apasai and grabbing her wrist. Apasai, no. Apasai glanced at Ichigo, then back towards the Soul King's podium, then at him again, then back. She grimaced, wrestling her wrist out of Ichigo's grip and turning away from Ichigo. It was almost like she was reluctantly agreeing, but this simply wasn't the case. If one asked Apasai whether she'd listen more to Aizen's words, or Ichigo's, well, the answer was explicit when it seemed that Shiro trusted Aizen enough but had said nothing about Ichigo yet. Apasai roughly shoved Ichigo, and grudgingly scowled. Sorry, but it's not up to you. Apasai dived, shifting forward in a huge burst of Sonido. Wait. Ichigo reached out, but he only grabbed empty air. Damn it. Ichigo gave chase, quickly catching up to Apasai with his greater speed, but Apasai already had a head start and the distance that the two covered in the meantime was more than enough. So, what if Ichigo caught up and tackled Apasai to the floor of the Soul King's podium if Apasai was already where she wanted to be? Grunting as Ichigo pinned her onto the ground, Apasai craned her neck up from her position to stare at the person she was looking for in the crowd of wary Soul Reapers still here in a daze. Silent. Apasai called out grimly, pissed off that Ichigo kept trying to cover her mouth and muffle her words. It got to the point that she could taste his fingers whenever she opened her mouth. The hell you put in my mouth? I'll bite it. I swear I'll bite it off, so let go. Snapping at each other, Apasai eventually managed to get in a headbutt from Ichigo's half-hearted measures, which gave her enough space for an opportunity to once again address Silent. Silent. I don't fucking know why, but that Aizen bastard said that we need you for this. As one of us, what are you doing standing over there dash? Ichigo once more managed to muffle Apasai's words, but it was already too late. The intent was delivered, but oddly enough, Silent wasn't the first to react. Aizen. Kisuk, the wizard, and the captains present immediately tensed at the name, his hind more so when he noticed Silent's telltale signs. The hairs on the back of his hind's neck raised. Masaki. Silent shook her head, giving no time for anyone to try and dissuade her, including Karen, who kept looking from Ichigo pinning a woman to the floor, then back to Silent. Of course, Silent didn't really trust Aizen as Masaki Kurosaki, but in her time as Silent, she knew that Aizen wasn't one to speak meaninglessly. Masaki, you can't be serious. Silent glanced at his hind, and smiled wryly, nodding ever so slowly before gesturing for Ichigo to get off of Apasai. Mom, I can handle this. I've grown strong. I'm not the kid you used to know. Silent didn't listen and softly shook her head again. There was a debt of gratitude she could never pay back, and shirking away when danger comes was something she couldn't bring herself to do. As a member of the Vasto of White's lands, she knew what had to be done. Ichigo, Ishine, and even Karen had fought their battles. This was hers, as a former human and a Quincy. Moreover, what mother would risk her family's life before her own? Light flashed, a mixture of searing heat born from the clashing of pressure and roars of maddened rage. Useless, it doesn't matter how many times I'm cut. Ayon heft the axe sword over a single shoulder, and cleaved down, once more bifurcating the Pernida before him into two. Reforming in their masses, more of Pernida inevitably emerged from the pieces. By now there were practically thousands of left hands wielding spiritual bows populating the entire area of this battlefield. Volley upon volley of spiritual attacks came down like rain, many batted away in annoyance while the rest hit their mark but left little damage. You annoying dash, Pernida was cut off by another solid strike. Regardless, the stalemate continued with neither side truly getting the edge over the other in this instance. However, Pernida was assured of victory. Although difficult to sense into the storm of spiritual energy, Ayon's power was gradually beginning to decline through exhaustion. Pernida wouldn't have this problem, making it only a matter of time before the situation was dealt with. Of course, Pernida had the mind to aim for Mila Rose and Sung Sun whom Apasai and Ichigo had left behind with Araniro, but Ayon's fierceness elevated immensely when they were targeted. It was to the point that there was no way to get past him. How frustrating! Pernida had never imagined himself to be so hard-pressed. It was a stain, a blemish on his impeccable record. Die! Pernida shot his nerves at Ayon once again, this time choosing to shoot them around him towards his surroundings. Massive spiritual walls ejected from the palace were immediately conformed to Pernida's will and compacted around Ayon like a ball in an attempt to crush him. A primal roar was the only response, followed by an obsidian axe sword piercing through the walls made of spiritually resistant stone. Pernida would never admit it, but it was starting to feel like he was going up against his fellow compatriot, Gerard Valkyrie, and his absurd power of miracles. Why won't this thing die? Unbeknownst to Pernida, but the situation was about to change rapidly. Apasai returned, Ichigo trailing behind her along with a new addition that had Waiwak fighting in the distance suddenly perking his gaze up in solemnity. Like Aizen had advised, Silent had arrived on the battlefield, participating in this all for the first time. Pernida was confused at the sudden uneasiness it felt, but had no explanation as to why this was quickly rectified. A spiritual bow formed in Silent's hands, her veins filling with spiritual energy and shining a dull blue in a Quincy technique that could harden and elevate the physical state of the body. Blood Vene. Quincy. Pernida rasped at the implication, trying to understand how it was possible without Waiwaka's designation. In fact, it was impossible, but the sight was right before it regardless. Silent fired upon a squirming mass cut off by Ayon, and suddenly Pernida shuddered. Aoswalan? The feeling was similar in that Pernida felt his power and spiritual energy being sapped from him and stored presumably within this vagrant Quincy. Why you, what are you? What have you done? Pernida's lone eye widened, noting Silent's own confusion on her face. Aizen never spoke without reason, and more, Apasai, Mila Rose, and Sung Sun had to grudgingly concede to the level of Aizen's wit and preparation. The zero. This too was a designation, but not something given as an alphabet from Waiwak, but a number to revert everything to the beginning. A foreign sense of dread began to manifest in Pernida. If there was one thing it knew, a Quincy's power would never take effect against another Quincy. Why? Who was she? What reason did she have to be on the enemy's side and not the Emperor? Regardless, this wasn't good. Pernida felt his very existence threatened from just being near Silent and began to gradually retreat. Silent fired another arrow, but Pernida easily batted it aside. It was one thing for Silent to shoot at Pernida's dismembered parts, but less he spread himself out, the denser Pernida's spiritual energy was to ward away attacks. It was too dangerous to split any. This damn beast. Pernida's eye widened in alarm. Ayon felt it then, what it needed to do from observation and a prompting from the influence of the axe sword. Now was the time. The opportunity for victory was here. Subtly, Ayon's body moved and entered a battle stance, sword held over his shoulder, knees bent, feet waist-length apart. "What's my boy doing?" a Pasai muttered upon noticing Ayon's change. "It's a stance, obviously, and that's my baby boy," Sung Sun chided. Uncharacteristically quiet, Mila Rose was looking higher up towards the world's sky. Lightning seemed to flash. Mila Rose opened her palms up and felt droplets hitting them softly. Rain, here of all places? In the next moment, the illusory sound of thunder began to echo and drum in a rhythmic beat that reverberated within the chest. Everywhere, everyone fighting took a moment to glance over. It was small, but a presence that seemed similar to Waiwak, Shiro, and Aizen's current state itself could be felt. Divinity. The presence of the divine and the legend matching with myth and lore were set. The prerequisites to enact a myth falling into place. Ayon's muscles rippled, a cloud of magic energy surrounding him to reveal a figure in the mist that harbored a gaze that paralyzed Pernida in place. The strength of a noble phantasm would only ever increase if brought about in the very setting of its use. A monster that could never die even after beheading in a form of limitless replication. A figure that stood up and defeated that beast. The son of the king of the Olympian gods, and the heir of thunder and lightning who would become a god. It was the song of Heracles and the Hydra. Slay the impossible, achieve the unimaginable. 9 lives. It wasn't Sonito, nor Shunpo, but something much more outside the realm of souls and mortality. Godspeed. For the first time, Ayon spoke. The Shooting 100 Heads. Chapter 74. Legends create majesty. Legends create dreams. Legends inspire and live on beyond death eternal. Break, shatter, tear. A sword alone can carve the way. A sword alone will tread through the beaten path, and strive towards the promised redemption. The light in Ayon's eyes momentarily dimmed to be replaced by the eyes of another. It was a giant of a man with a presence beyond a simple soul. Pernida felt a shudder travel down its body, a permeating sense of desolation suffocating it in its intensity. "You, who are you?" It was simply a beast enshrouded in madness. "My labors. My vindication." Muscles bulged starting from Ayon's grip all the way to the rest of his robust body, rippling with sheer physical power. "My doubts. My fears." The sword shifted ever so slightly, the knees dipping, veins popping over skin. "My will." Thunder echoed within the heavens, writhing masses of lightning crackling into arcing tendrils. Ayon who still had something to protect, and he, a Zanpakuto spirit who'd watched its user lose everything through his own hands, never again. Time will enter its twilight. The world seemed to come to a halt, sound entering silence, sensation entering muted numbness. Everything was still, and yet from one spirit's perspective, it was only a breath's time. 9 lives. No matter how many times it would be cut, more and more would appear. Its scales were iron, its breath, a corrosive poison. Its teeth were razors, its claws a storm of serrated blades. Recall it. The desperation, the rapid beating of the heart, the roar of flowing blood in that moment. When despair creeps ever closer, and the vitality of life grows ever dim, the hands that wielded a bow are the same hands that hold this sword. The Shooting 100 Heads. Spiritual energy erupted from around Ayon as everything simply just moved. There were no indications, no warnings, or signs, it was instantaneous. One moment, thousands of Pernida's hands filled the space to the brim, and in the next, blood was showering. What? Pernida's voice echoed, the sheer bafflement and confusion mixed within, tinged with incomprehensible wariness, but even that was muted in the droning hum of Godspeed. It was practically impossible to react to, let alone for Pernida who never bothered dodging in a fight to care about doing so now. A berserker's war shout reverberated in the sudden quiet, a final swing brutalizing the rest of Pernida's bodies now scattered into fragments of sand siphoned away. "He's just going to reform," Sung Sun gnashed her teeth before Mila Rose nudged her side and gestured, her lone arm full with carrying Araniro. Frowning, Sung Sun turned to a Pasai, Ichigo, and silent. The atomized pieces of Pernita that should have reformed were all flowing in Silent's direction, glowing in faint blue spiritual light. It was surreal in the sense that it was neither forceful, nor too passive. Like floating dust in the wind, the particles gathered into a funnel that directly attached itself to Silent's spiritual signature, robbing Pernita of its power. As expected, Aizen's voice echoed in Silent's ears, she, the most dumbfounded of all. All Quincy possess the means to harness and gather spiritual energy from the environment to create spiritual constructs and arrows. In which case, it can be considered a natural inclination, a subconscious tendency to naturally circumvent the flow of the order set by the Soul King. Granted, Quincy are by extension, conduits of Waiwak, thereby creating an aspect of rebellion, but I digress. Simply put, you, a Quincy that shouldn't exist under Waiwaka's eyes, have somehow transcended the rest an unknown factor with a voracious appetite. Silent mulled over the words, feeling as if the majority of what Aizen muttered was mere speculation. However, what was also true was the situation that was unfolding. Outstretching a hand, she could feel Pernita's energy flowing into her, increasing her own reserves and elevating her level of existence. Her brows furrowed in worry and doubt. If there was any true sign that she wasn't the same as she was before despite turning into a hollow, it was this. What exactly had happened to her? She was a variable that shouldn't have existed. No, she was a variable whose existence she knew was impossible to begin with, and yet here she was. Inexplicably, the process of her conception into her current form was what played a key factor into everything. Waiwak was the son of the Soul King, making the power he granted to Quincy on the level of the divine, and yet Silent's circumstances weren't so different. Having been consumed by Grand Fisher, the energy stored in a certain sword's dual aspects of demonic and holy powers belonged to a similar level of existence. If Waiwak was a container that freely held and granted his breadth onto others, then Silent was a conduit who'd processed similar powers to obtain her current identity. Coupled with a Quincy's ability to harness and assimilate the energy of their environment, Silent's circumstances had evolved to assimilate the energy of her creation, holy attribute, or the divine, the energy of the Soul King, Waiwak, and by extension, all other Quincy. Hence, 0, the origin beyond the granted letters. You know, I hate the guy, but it actually worked, Mila Rose murmured, lips curling, half satisfied, half annoyed while thinking about Aizen. She shifted her weight and slung Araniro over her shoulder before inwardly sighing in relief that they'd won. Afterwards, came appreciation. The way Mila Rose proudly looked at Aion in pride was practically mirrored by Apasai and Sung Sun. Though Sung Sun was trying to be more reserved about it, there was no hiding the constant tugging of her lips, and it was truly justified. Aion was strong, making one have to think twice about underestimating Sung Sun, Apasai, and Mila Rose in a tight situation. Already, they'd sensed even Lady Haribel take a glance in the middle of all the fighting. In any case, across from Mila Rose and the others, Silent was still standing rooted as the last of Pernita's energy was absorbed by her. Frankly, she didn't know how to feel, or how to react. Judging by what happened just now, she didn't have to be stupid to infer that she was likely to be spirited away from battle to battle. Lost in her thoughts, she ended up making the mistake of growing complacent despite openly proving her importance in this war. Mom. Ichigo's voice resounded in Silent's ears before she felt a blur of movement whisk her away from the spot that she was standing. A second later and several penetrating beams of light utterly decimated the area in which she had stood. Unfortunately, not everyone had been as quick to react as Ichigo, who'd trained his focus on protecting his mother from the moment she'd been goaded here by Apasai. Aion. Mila Rose suddenly grabbed Apasai by the shoulder before she could lunge forward. In front of them, several holes had suddenly appeared to pierce through Aion's entire body. The wounds were caused by the same rays of light that tried to pierce through Silent earlier, but with only a single difference. A majority of the beams had focused on the arm that Aion was using to hold onto the obsidian axe sword, and directly severed it. The sword sailed through the air, and was lost in the turbulent winds and power surges of the battles occurring all around. In the distance, a being with 8 golden wings mottled with holes was peering over. On his figure was a priestly garment, his face crossed with white lines while a large halo hovered atop his head. The figure had noticed the peculiarity. It hadn't been Aion that was the main factor in the increase in strength and abilities, but the sword in Aion's hands. Upon separation, there was a distinct change in Ayeon's temperament. He began howling and raging like a primal beast, losing the steady cool of the figure who'd struck with an unseeing blow. Moreover, Ayeon didn't even try to dodge when several more beams of light shot towards him and tore him into pieces. Sung Sun, Mila Rose, and Apasai flinched, pain shooting up their offered arms as Ayeon died and his remains returned to them. The three would have to regather their spiritual energy to an optimum level if they wished to resummon Ayeon in any capacity. Given their present state, it wasn't likely. Fucker. Apasai grimaced, glaring at the figure in the sky, but almost cowering when the figure's gaze focused on her. She knew that she wouldn't be able to dodge the speed of the light beams, and felt dread pool in her stomach. Shit, he's going to attack again. Mila Rose pushed Apasai aside and unabashedly raised Aeroniro up as a shield. If they were going to get hit, he'd contribute first. Hey. Ichigo gritted his teeth at the sight of his cousin's fate, but he had no room to worry about him now. The figure's attention was also locked onto him and silent. Focus. Tensing their bodies, the air suddenly shifted with unbridled spiritual pressure. The figure hadn't been the opponent of Apasai and the others, but someone else's prey. Instantly, several world-shaking Ceroblasts were fired at the figure, but all phased through it. At this, Coyote lowered her gun across from her opponent and grimaced that her opponent had the time to observe another's battle. Then again, everyone had taken notice of Silent's development. Even Yahacha's features crinkled into a frown in the distance, feeling as if there was an arrow pointed towards him. However, even if he wanted to do something about it, he couldn't with both Aizen and Shiro pressing him. Therefore, he could only leave it to the members of his upper echelon, one of which had already taken the initiative. Leo Baro knit his brows, letting out a small hum as numerous Ceros shot through him. He was the one who'd effectively neutralized Ayeon's threat when an opportunity had presented itself in the beast's triumph. It was a simple matter. Although Ayeon's feat had been able to inwardly unnerve Leo to a degree, it wasn't enough to make him panic, but observe further. This was how he'd noticed the peculiarity of the sword that Ayeon was wielding and opted to sever it. Still, Ayeon was a secondary priority compared to the one Leo had actually intended to eliminate. Pernida's sudden loss inwardly ruffled him. Given Pernida's ability and the gift bestowed by the Lord, Pernida shouldn't have been defeated by a mere show of strength or lethality. Instead, what enabled Pernida's defeat was nothing else but the arrival of a single clueless-looking woman. More than anything, his instincts screamed that the woman was dangerous. Leo narrowed his eyes through the ambiguity of his humanoid-looking head. His form was no longer the same as his base, as he'd activated his shrift. Understanding the gravity of the situation, Leo had started the battle using his Quincy, Volstandig. He'd already suffered from his own arrogance prior, and got killed by an attack he hadn't been able to perceive in time. It was only through his Lord's grace that he was returned to life, and he would not forget his Lord's favor. From Waiwak, Leo was granted the power of the X-axis. It allowed him to pierce through anything in his line of sight with perfect accuracy and without the need for projectiles using his rifle. It cannot be blocked by any defense, and in his Volstandig, the beams of light he could shoot out all carried the same property. So long as he could perceive it, it would be penetrated with unerring accuracy. The strongest aspect of this ability itself was the means to pierce through attacks in a form of intangibility. Any attack that came at him that he could visualize, perceive, or discern would simply pass through him as his body was enshrouded by the power of the X-axis. He was basically invincible in any form of combat, making him develop the habit of keeping one eye closed. This had cost him in the Soul Society when an inconceivable blade killed him in an instant. In this form, he could see all. There was no longer a weakness to be taken advantage of, but nonetheless, this was why his focus fixated on the woman. Somehow, someway, if she got close, Leo felt on some level that he'd experience difficulty in managing his Lord's gift. A fellow Quincy. This much was clear for Leo to observe from the woman's actions, but that in itself was what confused him. What was that power? It obviously wasn't something granted by Waiwak, but it carried similar properties to the Lord's holy selection. Didn't that mean that the woman could siphon off their power if she so willed it, or was it an unconscious factor? Leo sneered. It didn't matter, as the whole situation simply left a sour taste in his mouth. The implication that Silent's existence alone could prove a detriment to Leal had him on edge as the captain of Waiwaka's upper echelon. When the chance had presented itself, he hadn't hesitated to attack, but the speed of that other hollow who saved the woman was surprising. A blast of potent spiritual energy momentarily redirected Leal's focus of attention. Futile, he scoffed. Scowling, Coyote fired again, trying to analyze the extent of her adversary's ability, and growing frustrated that nothing seemed to work. She was stronger than Leal. This was for certain as power output practically dwarfed his by leagues, but at the same time, her attacks just wouldn't hit. Shifting her weight to the side, Coyote nimbly fired several rounds to counter the beams of light sent her way. Even if Leal appeared intangible, the attacks he fired were still made of tangible spiritual energy, allowing Coyote to deftly block them shot for shot. Shockwaves lifted dirt and white sand into a storm, Coyote careful to keep her eyes trained forward. Flicking the sleeve of her left hand, the furred overcoat slung around her shoulders fluttered to reveal a second gun within. Snagging the handle of the gun with the pinky of her left hand, she twirled it into her grip and fired to her left. TCH. Bang. A blast resounded, followed by an annoyed huff. Coyote could hear it. No, since it was a more apt description, but there was no need for any further thoughts on the matter. The way her opponent fought was practically at the height of arrogance. Leal neither bothered to dodge, nor put much care in anything Coyote was doing, focusing instead on an unending barrage of attacks, marksman to marksman. Call Milo, she whispered the call for a fang. Blue spiritual light soon curved around the handles of her revolvers and formed a sharp point overhead. Her eyes shut, her muscles growing taut. Sonido. The buzzing of the wind echoed. Meaningless, Leal's derided, the mottled wings over his back forming several beams of light as Coyote suddenly appeared and cut across Leal's neck. This attack too, phased right through, leaving her open for attack. Gnashing her teeth, Coyote rounded, flipping herself to reorient and raising her revolvers to fire back against the ensuing onslaught. Bang. The losing side in a battle is always slow to understand and slow to react. Coyote tumbled across the air from the impact, her heels dragging into the spiritual platform she formed beneath her. Blue flame-like energy ignited around her left eye before blazing into a fiery verdant hue in the shape of a skull and crossbone. Los Lobos. Wolves, Coyote muttered beneath her breath, the fur of her gray coat shooting out into dozens of spiritual wolves. Do you not understand? Coyote ignored the preaching. She'd already experienced the suffocating loneliness of loss. To her, she could accept nothing else but victory if defeat meant subjecting herself to that specific hell again. Go. The spiritual wolves around her bound forward, streaking through the air on powerful hind legs. The dull glow over Coyote's lone eye acted as a targeter, directing the wolves to converge. Another useless endeavor. When one stands before the presence of an envoy of God, the disparity only becomes that much clearer. Leal continued to speak, but Coyote was too focused on developing a battle strategy to care. One wolf tried to bite into Leal's wings, but once more phased right through, followed by the rest. Legs, head, body, arms, hands, eyes, halo, it didn't matter where Coyote chose to direct an attack. All yielded the same result. Zeros don't work, physical blows don't work, concussive impact from explosions don't work either. Coyote gradually began to ball her hands into fists. Her observations were leading her towards a path of no victory. How could she circumvent this? Sure, she could think of a way to do some form of damage, but it wouldn't be enough to kill. Vision, no perception. Already, Coyote had discerned that the main factor of Leal's power. The closest she'd come to doing any form of damage was in the smoke of her Zero's explosions. Coyote had noted a delay in Leal's intangibility in that moment, but even then, there was no way Leal would be able to not sense an attack coming. Zero's and her own general fighting style were too over the top as most wouldn't be able to survive against her to begin with. Coyote was stuck in a rock in a hard place. She was stronger than Leal. Just the difference in their present power output assured her, but right now she was weaker. Blocking several more beams of light, scratches and grazes formed over Coyote's hardened skin. While all she could really do while observing was defend and accumulate injury, Leal remained in a peak state. Soon enough, the difference in their spiritual energy would even out as Coyote took more and more damage. Thinking. Leal was smug, his voice almost condescending. How useless. From the moment His Majesty entered this place, the spirit of resistance has already fall dash. You talk too much, Coyote interrupted in scorn. Leal shut his mouth, but quickly followed up with several more strikes that unexpectedly managed to pierce a quarter-sized hole through Coyote's left shoulder. Blood spurted over her coat, her expression twisting as she backpedaled in a bid to now determine her adversary's range and speed of attack. Time of delay, none. Coyote twisted her foot and sidestepped with a burst of sonito, then another, and another, until all that were left were after images. Such a tactic will never work against an envoy of God. Leal's 8 wings unfurled and from each hole in the peony 1 feathers of light, beams formed and fired, simultaneously striking each after image. Widening her eyes, Coyote clicked her tongue and immediately fired a retaliatory strike point blank. The subsequent impact had her plummeting to the ground where she bent her knees and gouged 2 scars into the flowing sand. She panted for breath, features remaining ever composed despite the dilemma she was facing. A method had to exist, a means to bypass her opponent's ability not through strength, but through another means. There was a way. Her mind had long since processed it. The problem was, as stated before, it simply wouldn't be able to kill Leal. Knowing that she couldn't risk being in Leal's line of sight as she formulated a strategy, she decisively shot into the hill of sand and dirt, creating a terrifying storm that she hid within. Leal swept his gaze in the ensuing cloud of dust, irritation clawing at him. His main priority was still silent, but he was no fool. After having been killed by letting down his guard, he would not do so again, especially when Coyote did possess the power to kill him if she actually got a shot in. As such, he'd decided to settle this problem before focusing on the others. Hiding like a rat. He goaded. Coyote wouldn't rise to it, her brows furrowing in thought until she noticed something at the corner of her eye. A Zanpakuto spirit. It was a woman with long vibrant red hair tied into a flowing ponytail. The fringes of her hair outlined her face, the glow of her eyes filled with a resolve for battle. On the spirit's figure was a form-fitting black combat suit that accentuated her curves without limiting mobility. Coyote stared at the Zanpakuto spirit, and the spirit stared back in turn within the cloud of dust and debris. "Allow me to aid you," the spirit spoke first. Unused to fighting with others that weren't her family, Coyote gave a knee-jerk reaction typical for someone of her strength. "I do not need your aid." The spirit snorted, crossing her arms and not shying away from staring Coyote dead in the eyes. "How do you strike something that can't be hit?" Coyote mulled the words and focused on the implication. "You speak as if you have a way." "Indeed, although certain conditions have to be met, which leaves me a little helpless on my own." Knowing that the dust would settle soon, and remembering how Starkey had asked her to get along better with others, Coyote eased her guard. "Continue." A flicker crossed the spirit's expression before she spoke in all seriousness. "Their strongest attack. I need you to goad their strongest attack." "Was that all?" Coyote hummed, recalling the method she'd devised internally. Sure, it wouldn't be enough to kill, but to aggravate into an all-out strike, it was possible. She nodded. "Very well. Oh, I like your resolve. You won't regret this." Saying this, the spirit smirked before dematerializing into the form of a blade protruding from a sphere. It was practically indiscernible from all the other weapons that could be found in Shiro's inner world, so Leal would never expect it. "For now, I'll wait for when the time is right." Coyote merely nodded, and said nothing else, preparing herself and letting go of her reservations. This wasn't the past. Things weren't the same as they'd been before. No longer was she pursing weakness, but instead, what she needed now was even more strength. As the dust finally settled, Coyote found herself face to face with Leal hovering in the air above her, but there was a notable change in her entire demeanor. She stood still, arms by her side, and gaze staring past Leal and towards the distant moon above. Memories of the past flashed and blurred, mixing with the lonely isolation of a figure wandering endlessly for family in a barren white desert. Never again. If power was what was necessary, then there was still one step left to take. Lilynet. Coyote tapped the butt of one pistol before shaking the other. "Starkey. Wake up. Oh you fucking slouch, you heard her. Lilynet's voice called. No reaction. Honestly it was expected considering Stark's personality, but before Lilynet could blow her fuse, Coyote's features grew more solemn. She understood. Gaining more power for her had always been something to fear. Shiro could stand her presence now, but what if she grew even stronger, and he too could not bear the weight of her existence? Given Shiro's current state, it was unlikely, but then again, Coyote had never actively tried to get stronger her entire life, but right now, there was a goal more precious than overcoming personal fear. Stark. Coyote whispered while watching Leal gather energy for another volley of strikes. Our pack. Our family. Weigh it, and then tell me your answer. A brief moment of silence. At the ready. Good. Here and now, a supposed envoy of God watches down upon the mortals below, never knowing the potential stored within. Even mortals can slay gods. To Stark and Lilynet, Coyote's form was that of their second release, but in truth, the transformation was in itself only a return to the base form of the strongest Vastolord that had ever existed. One more ascension existed. The true release. Blinding light and searing heat exuded from all around Coyote like a torch, filling the area with dense spiritual pressure. Coyote's hair whipped back, her gray coat billowing in the wind of her surging power. Resurrection, Segunda Etapa. All at once, her energy expanded out and encompassed her form, her injuries healing, as a vivid pair of predatory eyes hardened into cold steel contrasted by steady howling. Myth speaks of a solitary wolf. The strongest of them all, shackled by chains it itself would have to grow and break out of. This chain in this instance was conceptual, in that it was the terror of loneliness that restrained the nature of the wolf within. Dios Lobo del Fin. God Wolf of the End. The wolf that swallows divinity, bringer of the end times. The chain shattered. Chapter 75. Smoke obscured the air, swirling and dancing in tune to the flow of storm-like spiritual energy potent enough to disrupt the order of the world. Light gleamed in the haze, a brilliant azure pushing through all adversity and diming all in its vicinity. The winds raged, the smoke swirling in tandem, taking shape into a feral wolf, boring down on those before it. Eyes of apathy. Teeth like swords. A long howl echoed before the image of the wolf condensed inward and funneled into a swirling pillar focused on the origin. Rip and tear. The air shuddered, the clouds to part, the white sand to disperse into tiny motes amidst the clanging of chains, followed into silence. The smoke cleared, the obscurity revealed under the chill of fierce wind. Coyote's hair had grown long, flowing behind her well past her knees. The last remnants of her hollow bone fragments had disappeared, leaving behind a coldly apathetic and unblemished face. Blue fang-shaped facial marks streaked from the side of her eyes like tears representing the despair of solitude. On her person, long flowing tufts of fur lined the outline of a gray vest wrapped snug over her long coat, the tails flickering in the breeze. Black thigh-length rider boots adorned her legs, reaching up to a denim-colored skirt, riveted with bone fragments on the ends. Star-shaped spurs jutted out from the back of each of her heels, and at the center of her chest across the vest she wore, the insignia of a wolf's maw was etched in crimson red. On her back, a wolf's tail swished behind her, a similar pair of wolf ears folded up in an almost subdued manner atop her head. Coyote remained in a crouch, one leg tucked beneath her while the other had its knee up to support one of her arms. Held in each hand were two distinct firearms. In her left was a modified Remington 870 model, lacquered in wood grain color, and streaked with the flame-like pattern of Lilynet's helmet piece. In her right, a long-barreled sniper rifle sleek in design and without any additions aside from the overall shape resembling a poised talon. On the handle of each firearm, long broken chains dangle freely. Coyote let out a breath, standing onto her feet all at once and losing any notion of Stark's laid-back attitude. Her eyes locked onto Leal, who didn't bother striking her throughout the entire transformation. Was it arrogance? Pride? Honor? Or perhaps none of those at all? Am I supposed to be impressed? Leal scoffed from afar, a derisive air in his demeanor and speech. An envoy of God need not lower himself to look upon those beneath it as equal. It was blatant disregard. Wordlessly, Coyote glanced up, her long hair lifting high. She'd said it before, but Leal talked too much. Raising her left arm up, she aimed without fanfare. "Do you never learn?" Leal hardly reacted if at all, choosing to aim his wings forward and charge his own attack. "The power bestowed upon me by Dash." Leal abruptly frowned, cutting himself off. Although he was prideful, he was no fool. As the captain of the upper echelon, he possessed both frightening battle instinct and awareness. The chains adorned on Coyote's left gun clinked and clacked, the motion seemingly mundane, but Leal felt it. This was different. Something had fundamentally changed in the method of attack. This was when Leal realized it, the difference. Before, when Coyote aimed and fired her guns, there would be an effect on the area around her, but this time, there was absolutely nothing. No indication of the level of the attack's output, nor the type of projectile attack it would be. Fast, slow, moderate? There was no tell. Only the assurity in Coyote's eyes spoke of her confidence. Those eyes. For a second, it reminded Leal of the indifference found within the gaze of his own lord. He shook his head, and gritted his teeth. The power of the X-axis was with him. Through it, he could pierce through anything he could see and perceive, making him invisible in battle. No. No. No one was his better. No one was his match. He was. How? Coyote whispered mutedly, the shotgun pointed forward with a single arm rapidly heating into a verdant green over the muzzle. The trigger pulled. Click. Left fang, Lilynet. There was no sound, no explosion. The space itself that Leal's body was occupying just vanished, and parts of Leal's body along with it as he barely registered the instinct to move. That's not Dash. Coyote fired again, the range of space eaten disappearing in a wide scattershot pattern. This was the nature of how Coyote figured she'd be able to wound her enemy by not striking Leal himself, but the space he occupied. The principle of this attack was that you couldn't phase through what wasn't there. By blasting through space itself, an area akin to the nether reaches of the Dango which no one could exist within was created, tearing anything apart into their base forms and snuffing out even that. Blood spurted out of Leal's mouth, parts of his exposed wings clipped and featherless from a further barrage of unseen bullets and shrapnel. It was the first injury Coyote had landed in the entire bout, but she didn't take heart. Coyote narrowed her eyes. Like she'd thought, it wasn't enough. Leal possessed the same sort of regenerative capability as Pernida. The parts trapped in Eden space could be utterly destroyed, but it didn't mean that everything was destroyed. The hole in space was only created for the fraction of a second Coyote's fang pierced through. Bits and pieces of white flesh that composed Leal's body lingered in the empty space, and from there, they rapidly healed to reveal Leal panting for breath. "Why you hit me?" His voice was baffled, unwilling to concede the result of the attack. And immediately countering with his own. Several beams of light crisscrossed and intersected towards a motionless Coyote. One pierced her shoulder, the other her stomach, and the one aimed towards her head was dodged by a subtle tilt. Blood trickled down the side of her lips from internal injury, but she hadn't moved for a reason. A trade-off. See. A mistake. A mistake was all that was. I wasn't ready. I wasn't prepared. Pierce. Coyote shifted guns, swinging her left arm back and shifting her right arm forward in its place. The bolt-action rifle leveled its form forward, its sleek barrel quickly heating up into a fiery blue. Right fang, Stark. Fast. No. It was instant. Leal's head splattered into pieces, the air and fragments left behind in the empty space vacuumed into a .905 caliber bullet hole, fracturing reality and leading into a black void. Not only did the empty space not disappear, but it funneled everything around it into it like a black hole. Unlike the last time, Leal's parts wouldn't be coming back. Both of them staggered at the mutual exchange, Coyote not letting out a single grunt or groan. A small hole had pierced through her shoulder and a wide area of her stomach. Blood dripped ceaselessly over the wounds, seeping into her clothing and drying into ugly scabs. Yet, this mattered little to her. Coyote inwardly grimaced, trying to move her left arm and noting its lack of mobility. As for her stomach injury, she focused and coated it in a thin layer of spiritual energy to stem the bleeding. In comparison, Leal had veins popping over his body, a new head sprouting from what was left of his now noticeably smaller figure. Was the exchange worth it? Well, from a logical perspective, and Coyote's own sense of battle awareness, no. No, it was not. She'd lost part of her mobility, and used a considerable amount of spiritual energy to fire both Lilynet and Starkey consecutively. Then, she was purposely injured in order to land her own blows. Her usefulness in the coming battle would be hindered unless she could get that human healer to look over her. As for asking the Shinigami? She'd rather go to hell. Regardless, the result of the exchange was as intended. Leo was seething, spiritual energy rapidly gathering around him in bulk and reaching terrifying levels. The wounds on his person, and even the missing parts sucked away, were being recreated right before Coyote's eyes, her lip twitching. It really wasn't worth it, she inwardly grimaced, but chanced to glance at the inconspicuous form of the spirit that had offered to lend its aid. This better work. I am the final Quincy upon whom His Majesty bestowed his power. Leo growled, parts of his body convulsing as it morphed and changed. I am his ultimate creation. Closer to God than any other man, for one such as myself to be forced into this form for a mere hollow is tantamount to heresy. Leo's body contracted and drastically reduced in size. His features changed in accordance. His complexion had grown fair, slicked back hair sprouting atop his head. His eyes, nose, and mouth now resembled that of an owl, a long beak over his face. The halogen shine atop his head, the halo, shrunk in size and gained pointed spikes. Leo's neck is elongated, resembling the body of a snake with white fur on its back. His wings morphed into that of bats instead of an angel's, tapering to points and losing their feathery shapes. In addition, his shoes expanded dramatically in horizontal length, giving him the appearance of a centaur, while his eyelids now opened and closed horizontally instead of vertically. Around Leo, the wind began to pick up into a terrible storm. Raising her good arm over her face, Coyote squinted through the gales, not a tinge of emotion bleeding into her features, ickering Leo all the while. Could she not feel this power? This strength that none but the king could match? Those eyes, were they not making a mockery of him? Leo's demeanor deteriorated as he sneered. Look and behold. It is he who is uninjured, he who is unblemished, he who is whole, whereas Coyote had blood splattered all over her. This was the gap. The disparity between a greater being and an ant. Leo raised a finger up on a scrawny white arm, light gathering into several bands that formed the shape of a striated concave bowl at his fingertip. Hear the trumpet of God. Leo declared and channeled his energy. Already he'd wasted too much time on this battle. That woman, that traitor of a Quincy, had to be dealt with first beyond all others. Cold, unfeeling eyes continued to stare down at Leo. It was that stare, that disregard, that irked him more than he could truly describe. It was like standing in the presence of the god of your faith, and conducting acts of sacrilege. Light generation, he inwardly intoned, a large ball of light adding to his gathered strike. No mortal can withstand the fury of a god's envoy. Leo's other arm came up now, and synchronized his amassed attack with that of the first. He would end it now in this single strike. This single instance. You will perish in this light's holy radiance. Subtly, Coyote tugged on an object she'd been keeping concealed within her inner coat. Imperiously, Leo pointed his fingers down from up high, calling the name of this miracle's creation and mouthpiece. Trumpet. An enormous blast barreled out into existence, capable of erasing all in its path. Victory was assured. No, it was a certainty, and yet Leo suddenly felt a chill inexplicably travel down his back. Coyote tossed out a spherical weapon that transformed into the figure of a red-haired woman in front of her. The woman looked harmless, but more than that, she felt harmless. Leo couldn't pick up any kind of spiritual energy within her strong enough to rival his own, let alone allow her to bypass the power of the X-axis. A sneer formed over his face. A bluff. That's all this was. Fanfare and needless drama. Did they really think he'd stop his attack just because some new variable appeared? No matter. He was fully confident in his lord's bestowed gift. This aspect could be inferred by anyone who could see his expression, and this went doubly for the woman who dared confront his strongest strike. A sense of calm chased away his uneasiness, but the tentative peace grew disturbed. You think you're invincible? The woman asked. The question did not deign a response. Leal was unmoved, but raised a brow in contempt. Think again. Leal's senses prickled, his eyes glancing to the edge of his periphery where someone he'd rather not be near him abruptly appeared. No. That traitor, why was she here? Right before Leal's gaze, Silent appeared piggybacked by Ichigo, whose speed far outpaced the rest. Leal's features hardened, recalling what would happen to him with Silent just being near his proximity. No matter what, he couldn't let himself die here. If he died here, then he could picture his end being no different from that of Pernitus. Humph, he sneered, forcibly calming his nerves. That was if he was butchered into pieces, and no matter how he thought of it, that outcome was unlikely. You think you're invisible? Leal's features gradually twisted. It was that ingratiating voice again. The confidence, the surety of it, it was practically an attack on his person. Leal didn't hesitate to increase the output of his strike in order to both swallow that woman whole, and simultaneously deal with Coyote. It was a mistake. The red-haired woman's visage hardened, magic energy swelling around her that worked on a different principle than that of spiritual energy. O gouging sword of the war god. It was a power that effectively annulled the aspects of law and time by nullifying it and focusing on the aspect of severing fate. A concept impossible to perceive, let alone interpret, by bending cause and effect. That which comes later will cut first. The chill Leal had been feeling abruptly turned into a shudder, his senses flaring at him. From the sphere floating over the red-haired spirit's right fist, a blade emerged, shining in divine luster thrust forward. Written in legend, it was a sword that placed the wind in the user's command, and could penetrate through any shield or wall to inflict piercing wounds from which none could recover. Once the opponent's attack was launched, there was no escape. It was aptly named for its purpose. Froggerach. The Retaliator. The spirit spoke 3 words before walking off in the deafening silence. You're already dead. A sun erupted in the form of a blinding light that left nothing behind except traces of spirit particles that once more funneled into Silent. // Down below, spiritual winds buffeted the area, the ground beneath their feet trembling with each clash and reverberating echo of steel. The chain bindings holding the Spirit King's podium aloft creaked and groaned as the entire structure showed signs of collapsing. Kisuke and the other Shinigami, still spectating the battles from the podium, wore increasingly stiffening expressions. Some were looking down on their feet, others with bloodshot eyes, and then there was Jin smiling all the while despite Rangiku fretting over him for not bothering to rest from his injuries, or maybe he was smiling because of Rangiku. No one would ever know what's going on behind that smile. In any case, Jin's reaction was the odd one out. Everyone else was restless for a simple reason that either irked their pride, sense of worth, or world views. They were being sidelined, this much was blatantly obvious. Many didn't know how to feel about it, and many more felt unresigned. Kisuke dipped the rim of his hat over his face, and hummed while assessing the situation around him, and then turning back to observe the status of his compatriots. Many were still injured from the aftermath of the Quincy's invasion of the Siridii, and then further weakened to augment training in the Danga. What was worse, was that Kisuke's efforts to facilitate a means to mount a counter-attack had backfired in that he should have used the Danga slots for others instead. He had been a tad too optimistic in the Zero Squad's capabilities and neglected the fact that sometimes power means nothing to wit. The results of this were shown in a scene few seemed willing to intervene in. To Shunsui, it might as well have been karma, for others indecision. The sound of a blade being drawn echoed to the rhythmic march of heavy footsteps. The mighty have fallen. Tissen's words were dull, but carried the will of firm resolution. The weight of your achievement can never condemn the weight of sins left buried. Where is justice if the people who guard and make the laws side with those who commit murder? Ichibe and the rest of the royal guard who'd been drained of their power by Aizen grimaced while drawing their swords. No matter what, their bodies were still imbued with the flesh and blood of the Soul King. If anything, they still had the strength of their physical bodies. It wasn't much, and everyone knew it. Tissen would slaughter them, but the man was dragging it out through his own agenda, no vindication. The governing body of the Siridii has nothing to do with the guards of the royal palace. Ichibe lost his smile. He'd lost it since the moment Aizen had intervened and ruined what could have been the only chance to turn things around. You speak of justice, but act in betrayal. You talk of sin, but do not see your own. In the end, what you seek is not justice, but an outlet for revenge. And what if it is? Tissen paused only a few meters away from the Zero Guard. He was fully within his striking range. Do not imply that you are not involved. The Zero Squad has long been created to safeguard the original arrangement of the Soul Society's noble families. If anything, it's your influence that condones the continuation of sheltering those unfit for their lofty titles. This world is twisted. This world established upon your so-called balance is wrong. My friend, the woman who only ever preached of peace dash. Tissen snapped, his drawn blade flashing and tearing through the feeble defense before him like paper. Blood began to flow, a horizontal cut cleaving through the proud flower insignia of the Zero Squad. Ichibei's countenance fell, a grunt escaping his lips while Senjumeru and the others tried to encircle Tissen but were batted aside by a blast of spiritual energy as if they were never there. She did nothing wrong. She looked not upon a blind child as a liability, but as a friend. She wasn't killed by a hollow in pursuit of her dream like she'd imagined, but killed in your system. Her killer, unpunished and left free. It is the duty of a Shinigami to give their life for peace, Ichibei reasoned evenly. He'd seen it, understood the happenings of the past, and the necessity of the present balance. The sanctity and harmony of the noble clans must remain even at the cost of the tragic few. Their sacrifice for the world allows for a few concessions. To live in a world without order, without structure, and regulation would revert all to the Dark Ages. Your order. Your structure. Your regulation. Not ours. Tissen spat back in scorn, each word followed by the clang of steel. Sparks grated from a blade's edge, and the spiritual steel of Ichibei's brush slowly lost ground to Tissen's sword. Today, I deliver due course. Spittle flew mixed with flecks of blood, as Ichibei was forced back again and again. For a moment, bewilderment entered Ichibei's eyes when he glanced at this fellow Shinigami doing nothing. By right, Kaname Tissen was an enemy of the Soul Society in principle for his betrayal to the court guard squads. As such, it was evident whom the Shinigami should side with, and yet many only watched, unsettled at the level of animosity Tissen was displaying. More than anything, it was the alarming implication that Tissen had insinuated that grounded their feet. They too had friends and family. To imagine one of them dying unjustly and the culprit left free from the law was nauseating. Then again, it didn't mean that no one acted. Another slash, and Ichibei's grip on his writing brush was wrenched free, the weapon clattering into a roll on the floor. Ichibei's countenance immediately fell. Know of a poor man's justice. Tissen swung vertical. Clang. Two swords shook as they warred with each other for dominance. Tissen's teeth gritted in frustration. Kaname, he ground out toward the figure he'd called friend before him. Komamura. Saijin sighed, shoulders slumping as he braced his sword with both forearms to defend against Tuan's overarching swing. The two stared at each other in silence, before Tissen began to apply more and more weight into his sword. Get out of my way. Old friend. You know of my goal. The one thing worth more to me than anything else. Saijin shook his head, behind him Ichibei began to catch his breath, irking Tissen off to no end. You'd defend him and his compatriots. Tissen practically roared, his tone guttural. The goal was in sight, well, within reach, and that's what mattered. No. I would defend my friend from making a mistake. Saijin put more strength into his arms and redirected Tissen's blade to the ground. Killing them does nothing. It means everything. Tissen snarled, teeth gnashing together. If you still treat me as a friend, then step aside. I cannot. Saijin remained firm. This isn't you. This isn't the man who spoke of peace and of carrying on the will of his friend. Veins popped over Tissen's skin, anger and frustration mixing with melancholy and weariness. You stubborn bastard, he muttered, but there was no turning back. A third sword stabbed forward faster than most could perceive and ended Tissen and Saijin's sword clash. Clap. Now, no need to fight. Jin clapped a few times to get attention, and when he did, he smiled from ear to ear. Kaname, good to see you. Just listen for a moment, will you, or do you think that you can take on Dogface while I take stabs at ya from the back? I may be injured, but you should know the speed of my blade. Saijin's lips twitched, the tension practically vanishing. Tissen ground his teeth. Ichimaru. In a way, it was ironic that the only other one to come and de-escalate the situation wasn't a member of the Siratii, but another traitor. Oh, a blind man's glare. Jin waved his hands up in feigned fright, chuckling. I'm terrified, ouchie. Thwop. Jiku-chan, whyyyy. Shut up. Rain-Jiku smacked Jin over the back of the head again, revealing that Jin didn't have the strength to resist let alone attack as his body all but crumpled at the blow. Flustered, and cheeks flaring from Jin's antics in public, Rain-Jiku huffed before dragging Jin away by the scruff of his shiakusho. The hell do you think you're getting involved with in your state? Ran-chan dash. Don't Ran-chan me. Jiku dash. I won't hear it, you idiot. Jin's head slumped, feet dragging on the floor while trying to placate his childhood friend. Understanding that Jin wouldn't be getting in the way, light flickered across Tissen's features. However, Jin's intervention was more than enough to rouse the others out of their daze. Differences in opinion aside, they were short-handed as it was. Then again, no one could put it past Jin to have expected this result before acting. In some ways, he was just as terrifying as Aizen. Suddenly, Tissen found himself heavily outnumbered as the Shinigami rallied behind Kisuk, who stepped forward. Sorry, but even as weak as they are now, the Royal Guard may have their uses to turn the situation around, Kisuk intervened while cutting a distinct line between Tissen and everyone else. Their powers may have been drained, but their bodies remain as containers that could assimilate the energy pilfered from the Soul King by Aizen and Wywak. It's what Ichibe and the others were planning to do before Aizen intervened. Isn't that right, Ichibe? You are correct. Better the power in our hands than a megalomaniac, Ichibe conceded. He got up from the ground, and brushed the dirt off of his clothing with the dignity of his stature. Tissen was far from impressed, but derisive instead. Better the power in the hands of the righteous than the hypocritical. He sneered. Kisuk disagreed. Aizen is far from righteous, let alone free from hypocrisy. I wasn't talking about Aizen. Tissen shook his head and withdrew his sword, knowing that he would have to wait for another opportunity. He glared at them all. This isn't over, he mumbled before vanishing in a flash step. Kisuk blinked at Tissen's answer, but frowned and chose not to dwell over it. What mattered now was what to do from here. The basic idea that was directly accessible to him was to regain the Soul King's lost power by using the Royal Guard as spare vessels. Then again, Masaki seemed to be doing a fine job of that from what he'd been able to infer when Masaki had been called over by the Hollows. In the end, Kisuk deduced that he and Aizen had reached similar conclusions to Masaki's current state, making it no wonder why Masaki was taken away. Of course, one specifically was not taking this development well and was already beyond the point of agitation. Kisuk shut his eyes, and gradually opened them to the sight before him. As expected. But Kisuk had to at least try. Ishine dash. I'm not leaving my wife and son on their own, Ishine gruffly cut Kisuk off, adjusting his Haori before deciding better and taking it off entirely. He wasn't going to fight as a captain or Shinigami, but as a husband and father. The Haori rustled as Ishine discarded it and whatever value it held or symbolized before putting a foot into the air and vanishing in a flash step like Tissen. He didn't even bother to wait for Kisuk or anyone else to try and convince him to rethink his actions. A nostalgic grunt resounded. That's the uncle I know, Kyokaku snorted. However, her hands were balled so tightly into fists that her palms were bleeding from her nails digging through her skin. Her attention and anxiety wasn't on Ishine, but on Kyan, who was unresponsively limp while slung over Milaro's shoulder. What did those bastards do to him? Kyokaku's lips wobbled, causing her to stammer as she muttered out. Neither Kyokaku, Kisuk, or the others had been able to notice the brief exchange between Kyan and Pernida in wake of the explosion that blew Pernida into pieces. Therefore, when Kyan had abruptly collapsed screaming, Kukyuko was only held back when Ganju tackled her to the ground. The two of them were too weak to get involved, and were obviously bitter about it to the point of frustration, but at least their worries were somewhat abated when Kyan was taken into one of the Hollow's hands. However, only abated. Bitches carrying him like some sort of ragdoll. Kyokaku gnashed her teeth while Ganju was no better. Kisuk chuckled. The way he saw it, it was good if Kyan was alive. A little rough treatment didn't matter. What did matter were other things such as, those in over their heads. If the father's gone, then no doubt. That's my family, I'd help them even if they're hollows. Karen hopped into the air, and vanished, likely in the same direction as Ishine towards where Ichigo and Masaka were. Again, as expected. Kisuk sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. Kisuk's Bankai that enabled his injured allies to fight was already consuming enough on him, and now he had to devise another means to reverse the situation for the better. He had no choice but to stay put and think to minimize consumption of his reserves while maximizing his time to ponder, leaving the rest to their own thoughts. The platform rocked and shook, the chains holding it aloft groaning from continued spiritual flares born from the clashing of powers. "Well, old man," Shunsui whistled, a hand scratching the ruffle of his goatee. "I never thought we'd see the day we'd be letting hollows fight on our behalf." Neither did Yamamoto. Worse, all he could do in his current state was watch. Around him, tongues of soft flames sputtered into gentle embers despite Yamamoto not summoning his sword. Subtly, Yamamoto let out a long breath. Somewhere in this world of swords and steel, Ryujinjaka was calling out to him in reflection. He couldn't help but recall his past encounters, and about how Ryujinjaka had always tried to pursue him. Perhaps there had truly been a reason. Ryujinjaka would never guess wrong. Perhaps, he really had been too stubborn, or perhaps he was just too old and grounded in tradition. Regardless, the days of the past were now gone, and his strength was a far cry from the man he used to be. Glancing in the direction where Coyote and Leal had been fighting, Yamamoto felt now more than ever the weakness of age. Waiwaka's words to him in the Soul Society hadn't been wrong. Yamamoto Shijikuni Genri Yusai had grown weak. No, if anything, he'd changed. Whether this was a good thing or a bad thing, it was difficult to say, but simpler to observe. Oh, the irony of the past. Once, it was the Hollows and Quincy at the mercy of the Shinigami, and now it was the Shinigami at the mercy of both. Yamamoto grunted, the sting of his injuries shooting prickling pain across his entire body. Nonetheless, he didn't let out a single word, not towards himself, nor towards Shunsui's rather blunt words. Instead, his wizened eyes grew weary, his flowing white beard losing its luster in resignation. The cycle had gone round. PFT. Our behalf. Swaifon spat and grimaced as she registered what Shunsui had just said. The man hadn't exactly been very subtle about it, and what was worse, was the lack of urgency in the undertone. Swaifon felt knots form in her stomach, twisting and churning in reflection of her growing discomfort and indignance. "Can't you all see?" she stressed, hissing. "We're just in the second course. What do you think will happen should either the Hollows or Quincy win? We all go on our merry ways and pretend we have no differences between us, or would you not cull a problem by the roots?" Indeed. It stood to reason that Swaifon's words were the most logical. Many Shinigami including Shunsui himself acknowledged the point with a curt nod, and as opinion began to sway, one voice interjected. It would not come to that. Motes of light danced through the air like fireflies, the Zanpakuto spirit presently healing Juushiro shaking her head. Instead, it's more likely that we can all go on our merry ways, as you said, she assured. Swaifon grimaced, pursing her lips in doubt. And we should trust that conclusion on your words alone, spirit. The spirit of the sheath nodded as if it was due course. It stood to reason that the man the spirit of the sheath knew wasn't one to follow the logic of others to begin with, but how could anyone presently take her words at face value beyond Shunsui? Sadly, noble spirit, we can't risk our lives and the lives of others on assumption. Anohana shook her head, her braided hair coming undone as resolution bled into her eyes. Swaifon agreed and nodded at this. She frowned, tapping a foot over the ground as she pondered aloud. We either need to conserve our energy if we wish to be able to do anything, or we do something now. After Swaifon finished speaking, she inevitably crossed her arms, huffed, and grudgingly looked towards Kisuk hoping he had some sort of plan. She may not like the man on a personal level, but she did acknowledge his wit and intellect. Everyone did. Surely, he'd already come up with something even now? He did. Or at least Kisuk used to. Initially, Kisuk would have wanted to secure the Soul King's safety and proceed from there, but with Aizen's intervention and the rapid escalation of hostilities and events, he'd been left honestly floundering. However, he was still a genius. Someone who could adjust to the situation and try to plan from there. Kisuk's lips thinned, a hand placing itself over his scraggly beard, his thumb resting beneath his chin. Yuryuki wordlessly walked up to his side and placed a hand over his shoulder. Whether or not he could come up with anything, no one could blame him. Yuryuki would be the first to protest otherwise. Eventually, Kisuk began to gradually formulate a plan of action, his head perking up. In his analysis regarding the energy readings of the Vasto of White, and his own observations of the former Hueco Mundo, certain principles had come to light. Then there was his data concerning Aizen, and the latest theories regarding Waiwak. Everything from here was dependent on who would come out on top during this conflict, or who he wanted to come out on top. As it stood right now, it was probably best to allow the Hollows to eliminate the members of Waiwaka's upper echelon before moving in on the big players. Till then, Kisuk rummaged through something he'd been keeping in a bag on his person, before pulling out a few items and distributing them to those around him. Here's what we do. On the side, the Zanpakuto spirit of the sheath knit her brows and sighed. Whether someone or a group's actions were right or wrong, in the end it was a matter of perspective. This, she could grudgingly concede, but it didn't change the feeling of disappointment. In time, they will see, surely. Check the description for the links to the author.